on Natural Resources will now come to order. Clerk, please call the roll.
Chairman Larson.
Here.
Vice Chair Phelan. Representative Cassell.
Here.
Representative Ashby.
Here.
Representative Workman.
Here.
Representative Lucio. Representative King.
Here.
Representative Price. Representative Navarez. Representative Frank. Representative Burns.
Here.
Okay, quorum is present. Good morning. I want to welcome everyone. We have come out here to study the Val Verde Groundwater District, or the Groundwater District concept. It's been filed, I think, 9 times, and the property owners, the city of Del Rio, there's a lot of differences, and I think our focus has been we need more science, and so the Water Development Board has gone through a process over the last year and have got a study. They've got some ideas on the management of the water out here. And so we'll have Larry French come up here in a little bit and talk about that. We also are hearing testimony on abandoned and deteriorated groundwater wells. That was a bill that Tracy King had last session, and it made it through the House, and it struggled through the process. So I want to thank the folks from San Felipe ISD for hosting us, and Representative Navarez will be here in a few minutes, and want to thank him for inviting us out to discuss this issue. We also have Representative Burns down on this end. He traveled from the beautiful community of Cleburne. We have Paul Workman. He came in from Austin. Trent Ashby came in from Lufkin. Tracy King came in from Uvalde. And Kyle Cassell came in from the greatest place in the state of Texas, College Station, Texas. So we appreciate you coming all the way from the different areas of the state. Why don't we get this deal started? If you want to come up and testify, we've got witness affirmation forms in the back. Just fill them out and bring them forward, and we'll have your testimony after we have invited testimony. So let's move on to the first item. Larry, you want to come up? The chair recognizes Larry French. Is that the longest walk you've ever had to give testimony? Well, good morning.
Good morning. Chairman Larson, members of the committee, would recognize Larry French with the Texas Water Development Board. Today I'm going to present the results of our study. The agency performed a compile and evaluate available information on groundwater resources in Val Verde County. We also focused on conditions in the Del River watershed and San Felipe Springs and Del Rio. And we also looked at the question of whether or not hydrologic triggers
Yeah, they can't hear you.
On top.
Yeah, I can hear that you got it on. You just got to move it up close to you.
Up closer? Okay, here we go. Okay, the study I'm about to report on stems from discussions held at the Capitol in late 2016 and even earlier among groups of lawmakers, agencies, local stakeholders, other organizations concerned about groundwater management in Val Verde County. And those discussions coincided with about the release of the TWDB report on Texas aquifers, and that quantified some of the groundwater surface water interactions in the state. Val Verde groundwater conditions were also discussed between the executive administrator of the TWDB and the executive director of the TCEQ as an area of concern, and that was mentioned in our priority groundwater management area report that was provided to the 85th legislature. So as I begin, I'd like to acknowledge and thank the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality and the Texas Parks and Wildlife Department as co-agency stakeholders in this effort, and for their assistance in helping develop the scope of work and providing information and review on the work that we've been doing. And also like to thank the local officials and landowners, other folks who've been helping out giving us information, perspective, local perspective, and history on groundwater conditions. Like you mentioned, we began this work about a year ago. We met with the other agencies to outline our scope of work, identify critical sources of information and data. And then on January 24th of this year in this room, we had a public meeting to kind of outline the scope of the work that we were attempting, kind of give us a rough schedule, and also ask for any input from stakeholders, and we did get some good information as we did that. We also committed to make our draft report available to the public, which we will be doing, so the public can also weigh in on and provide any comments and information on the draft report before we make it final by the end of the year. I'd like to also thank the Devils River Conservancy, Nature Conservancy, and other folks who hosted our team on a trip to the Devils River earlier this year. It was very, very helpful. Okay, so for the rest of the presentation, I'd like to focus on two main things. One, just kind of go through our key findings on the groundwater conditions, and then outline some possible options and approaches for groundwater management. So I'll be referring to, you should have some paper handouts, and I think there'll also be slides projected on the screen as well. So actually looking towards slide number 3, which is a map, that shows some of the major hydrologic features of the county. As you know, the Rio Grande forms the southern boundary of the county, and the Devils River and Pecos River are the two major north-south drainages, and they both contribute a significant amount of water to the Rio Grande. The map also highlights the San Felipe Springs and Del Rio, the Good Enough Springs, which are under the Amistad Reservoir, and other springs that are significant that occur along the Pecos and Devils River. In terms of aquifers, the entire county basically is underlain by what we call the Edwards Trinity Plateau Aquifer. It's a major aquifer, probably one of the largest land areas that's covered in southwest Texas. Most of it's exposed. When you drive across the county, you're driving on top of the aquifer, basically, so you're seeing those rocks. It's a limestone rock, mixtures of limestone and shale, and as I'm sure you're aware, limestone is subject to dissolution preferentially along cracks and crevices, forms what we call a karst kind of feature, promotes formation of caves and conduits, which is oftentimes a preferential flow for groundwater. Where groundwater occurs in these kinds of zones, groundwater movement can be extremely rapid, as we know from even in the San Antonio and Uvalde area where you have similar kinds of phenomenon. But when you have rock that's massive and doesn't have fractures in it, it moves very slowly. So you have these two kinds of systems that can be in operation in the groundwater. And it leads to some very spectacular well productivity and spectacular springs. Sometimes it's hard to predict if you're going to find a good producing well or not. So it's where you hit fractures or not. Excuse me, throughout the county, there's a number of groundwater wells, observation wells. We've been able to tap into the data, and we've used information from measurements of flows and springs and stream gauges that can provide data that link all these systems together. So on the next slide and following slides, I'll have some bullet points just to run through. The aquifer basically forms regionally a plateau, the Edwards Plateau, and this is probably not the most exact way to describe it, but you can kind of think of Val Verde County as like on the downhill slope of that plateau. And groundwater is basically, in a regional large picture sense, draining out of that aquifer through the Pecos River, Devils River, and all the various creeks and springs and so forth. They're regional points of discharge for the groundwater. The one interesting feature, or actually many interesting features, but the Amistad Reservoir has a big influence on groundwater elevations around the area. As that lake was impounded, the reservoir water, as it filled up, it penetrated into the surrounding rock and raised water levels in kind of a zone or a halo around that reservoir. And as we've looked at water levels and looked at chemical analyses and compared reservoir water and groundwater, we can see that lake water has influenced some of the groundwater around that area. However, when you look at the whole county-wide area, it doesn't affect all portions of the county. In fact, most of the county would probably not be affected directly by the Amistad Reservoir. But when we look at other information like stream flow data, particularly in the base flow of the Devils River, that's entirely from groundwater discharge, and that has remained, in our analysis, has remained essentially the same for the last 100 years. Really not much change in the flow of that river. However, as we've noticed, there is concern that possibility of future and persistent droughts or the possibility of groundwater development in the county would change that picture. It could lower groundwater levels, and that would affect river flow and spring flow in those areas. So there is ongoing work. Even as we've compiled available information, we're very aware that some organizations are continuing to collect data and information. In particular, the University of Texas Bureau of Economic Geology is busy looking in detail on a portion of the Devils River to gauge the relationship between groundwater and surface water interaction and how they work together. Moving on to the next slide, I have slide number 5. We have found that Val Verde County does not currently have a shortage of groundwater. Historically, and this information is not easy to come by, but groundwater pumping in the county has been fairly limited, probably around 5,000 acre-feet per year. That doesn't include water that issues from the San Felipe Springs, which supplies the city of Del Rio. But so county-wide pumping of groundwater has been fairly limited. When you look at the value of what we call the modeled available groundwater, which is a policy-driven number, but reflects groundwater availability in county, that number is roughly 50,000 acre-feet per year. So roughly about the usage has been roughly 10% of what could be pumped to satisfy a desired future condition in the county. That desired future condition, which was adopted earlier this year by groundwater districts in GMA 7, is basically tied to the discharge, maintaining discharge in San Felipe Springs. Actually, it's exactly expressed as total net drawdown should maintain an average annual flow of 73 to 75 million gallons per day at San Felipe Springs. And that's about 81,800 to 84,000 acre-feet per year, so a good amount of water. So the desired future condition of the county is tied directly to maintaining that flow. And to develop that number, the districts in the GMA and the consultants that helped them simulated hypothetical well fields in the county centered in the southeastern portion of the county that was used to basically, if those were to happen, that was modeled into the desired future condition. So really, when you look at it, the desired future condition focuses mostly on a small portion of the county, the southeastern portion of the county around Del Rio and the San Felipe Springs and that watershed. It doesn't really address conditions, even though it's expressed for the county, but it doesn't really address conditions, for example, in Devils River and other areas, western areas of the county. So let me talk a little bit on the next slide to getting to some of the data. We can talk about water level trends and so forth. And we were able to access quite a bit of groundwater level data throughout the county. But this slide that you have there is a hydrograph. Let me see if I can see my picture of it here with 2 wells that we've installed in the county near the Devils River. And these are what we call recorder wells. And these are wells that are instrumented with recording devices which continually measure water level changes. So for most of the county, most of the wells that we have here, we get periodic measurements, probably at best once a year, repeatedly, and sometimes not that much. The value of the recorder wells, and they're part of a network that the Water Development Board has, roughly 200 of them around the state, hopefully in your counties as well, but not all yet. These are wells that you can access the data online, and you can see at any given time what's going on within the aquifer. And sometimes, even though groundwater can move slowly, in aquifers like the Edwards Aquifer, Edwards Trinity Plateau, it can move rapidly, respond to changes in recharge and drought and so forth. So these are very valuable sources of information. And we've used this information at these 2 wells to help kind of fill in the gaps between these like annual or even longer term measurements. And as you can see from the pictures of the graph, we have 2 wells here The one in orange is I believe let's see, is that I think that's the shallow well, which is roughly, the water level in there was roughly, over the last 10 years, varied about a foot or so not much. And the same picture with the deeper well, which is over 700 feet deep. So you can see this is sort of the basis of our statement that water levels have been fairly stable even in this particular area. And we can extrapolate that information, at least those trends, to make some judgments about water levels within the county that they've been relatively stable. There are a few blips, you call them, and they could be equipment issues or maybe sudden recharge. But by and large, the information is useful because it shows kind of a continuous record and also a fairly flat trend there. And that's the kind of information that we would hope decision makers would incorporate into their judgment on when you lead to the question of hydrologic triggers and so forth, and how to set them and how to identify them. Moving on to the next slide, I think the second to the last slide is the topic of groundwater management. As we know, that's been a topic of discussion from a number of folks. Currently, without a groundwater conservation district, there is no mechanism to manage the resource. It's basically an unmodified rule of capture, which is the fundamental principle throughout the state, but can be modified where there are groundwater conservation districts. I'd already mentioned that this county is part of Groundwater Management Area 7. It's one of the largest management areas. It's a regional management area of 21 groundwater conservation districts, and it has 33 counties in it. So it's a large area with a lot of diverse groundwater conditions and uses within it, even though it's the same aquifer. As we looked at the question of whether or not hydrologic triggers are feasible, our answer is yes, they're very feasible. In fact, they're in use throughout the state. They've been used for some time in the Edwards Aquifer, the San Antonio area. The Edwards Aquifer Authority uses a couple of index wells very successfully and looks at the water levels in those wells in the Edwards Aquifer to help make decisions on conservation, when conservation stages kick in and so forth. Other districts like the Barton Springs Edwards Aquifer Authority up closer to Austin also uses very similar index triggers to help manage the aquifer. And even north of Austin in the Edwards Aquifer, the Clearwater Groundwater Conservation District in Pell County uses similar combination of wells and spring flows to manage the aquifer. So it's a well-established approach, and certainly would be workable if a district were to be established in Val Verde County. We did not, at this point, we did not feel that we had enough information to propose specific locations or specific numerical criteria. We looked at simply the question, would it be feasible to do? We think there's enough data that effort could get started. But that's also has a policy flavor to it, and that would be definitely something that the local community would want to be part of, looking at those kinds of issues. I'd like to take a slight detour just for a second onto the issue of groundwater models, because that's a tool that's used throughout the state to help as a management tool, as a tool to help inform decision makers on various choices that can be made in terms of policies and so forth. There have been several groundwater flow models that have been constructed, developed, that cover groundwater conditions in Val Verde County. The first one is one the Water Development Board has produced. It's the Edwards Trinity Plateau Groundwater Availability Model, or the GAM. This is a very large model, very regional. It includes Val Verde County. We use it as a tool to assist groundwater districts in the region to help their management plans, and can be used and we use it for desired future conditions and developing the modeled available groundwater. But there's several other models that have been developed. I'm sure you'll hear about today or have heard about recently. One we're calling the Val Verde County model, which is a model that was developed in cooperation with the county and the city of Del Rio. That model basically took as a starting point the GAM but did a better job in terms of kind of narrowing in on the details, did a finer grid mesh in the county so you can look at a lot more details, re-looked at some of the technical parameters, some of the aquifer properties locally within the district, and assigned more appropriate local values than we could do in the regional GAM. So that's a model that actually we've also used just recently to develop the model available groundwater for the county. So the board has used that, the agency has used that model already and is familiar with it. There's a couple other models that are also relevant. The Devils River Watershed Model, the Southwest Research Institute developed a model that was focused on the Devils River watershed, different than the other two models in the sense that it's focused on a specific rivershed and also incorporates and couples a surface water model with it. So it's very useful for looking at the surface water groundwater interaction there. And so that's also a model that's useful, but it's only limited in terms of its area in looking strictly at the Devils River watershed. There's also a lower Pecos River watershed model that covers the western part of the county. Uses a different modeling code than the other models, so we did not look at that in detail. We have not been able to actually run either one of those latter two models, the watershed models. So we're less familiar with that, but have read the articles and listened to presentations on it. At this point, based on what we know, we feel most comfortable in terms of a county-wide tool that would be available currently to use would be the Val Verde County model. It's based, not the GAM, but based on the GAM, has been used, and it covers the entire county, so it would address kind of the full scope of groundwater issues within the county. And it's also capable of simulating spring flow, which is, of course, a really key and critical portion of any model that you want to have used here. So that's kind of the end of my detour on modeling, but just thought it would be helpful to explain at least what we've looked at. So finally, the last slide that I have here is a map showing what we identified as possible groundwater management zones. Groundwater management zones are a tool that's available in the water code, it's mentioned, and a number of districts around the state have used management zones because, as you're well aware, the aquifers, they vary even within counties, and there's appropriate both in terms of vertical stacking of different kinds of aquifers, and laterally there can be changes within the aquifer, changes within use, where it's appropriate to look differently at different portions of the aquifer. We think that's the case here in Val Verde County if a district were to be formed. We're not saying that this is the only way to skin this cat. There could be other ways to identify management zones. We think it makes sense to look at a watershed-based look. So we've identified at least 3 of the zones looking at the Pecos River, Devils River, and then the watershed for the San Felipe Springs as identified there. We also kind of carved out an area because the Amistad Reservoir has such an influence on groundwater. We thought it would be worthwhile considering looking at that as a separate management zone. Again, that's just some ideas. Would be worthy of looking at that or maybe other options. They each have distinct characteristics. We don't think that a one-size-fits-all strategy would be appropriate for the county just because of the diversity of needs, uses, and concerns throughout the county. We also know that there's also been other approaches. We would tend to favor an aquifer-based triggers that would incorporate spring flow and stream flow. The Southwest Research Institute has also proposed, I know in a presentation, they've done some evaluation of stream gauge data within the county and identified some possible triggers that could be used based on spring flow in the stream flow in the Pecos and the Devils River and other locations. That could also be a way to look at hydrologic triggers as well. There's any number of ways that one could look at this. Those are some of the ways we've looked at. We feel that although it's well recognized, there's a high degree of connection, probably one of the most in the state, of surface water and groundwater. It's easily visible. There's still details yet to be worked out. I mentioned that there's ongoing research. Depending on which direction local folks want to go, there may be a need to do some targeted studies to help support particular hydrologic triggers and so forth. But so more work could be needed in those areas, just depending on which direction they want to go. So that really concludes what I have to say, my testimony. I'd certainly be happy to answer any questions you have. I want to thank you for the opportunity to talk to you.
Anybody have any questions? Yes, Representative Ashby. Also, I'd like to recognize that Pancho Navarez, he's been our host. We appreciate you allowing us to come down and discuss this issue.
Thank you for coming, everybody. I appreciate it. I know it's a long way for some of you, but I appreciate it. And I apologize I'm late. I've got, I had a funeral this morning, then I got another memorial I got to go to in San Antonio this afternoon. So I'm not dressing like this because Todd dresses like this.
Okay, that's good. Yeah, Representative Ashby.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Poncho, it's good to be with you in your district down here.
Appreciate it.
It's good to see how green you are.
Yeah.
I think you're greener than East Texas.
You know what? We maybe 2.5 weeks ago, I was up in the air just before the rain we had last week and this week, and it wasn't that green, but it's amazing what a little bit of rain
Yeah.
can do. So
Yeah,
thank you for
looks good.
dancing out there for us. 'Cause we
Absolutely.
appreciate
That's what we're here for. Let me go. Larry, thank you for your presentation. Just a couple of quick questions. Clarify, so Val Verde County is not in a groundwater conservation district, is that correct?
That is correct, yes.
Okay. And I know back during the session, we talked a lot about this issue, dealing with the Devil's River. And so, pardon my lapse here in terms of memory, but I know there was a lot of discussion about the groundwater, potential overpumping, for lack of a better word, of groundwater, and the impact that could have on the flow levels along the Devil River. Can you just succinctly remind me what the issue is there?
Yes, there have been, over the last number of years, there have been a number of proposals for developing water well fields within the county and for export to other places. None of those have come into being, but certainly there is a lot of there is certainly a good amount of groundwater in the county, and it's an attractive resource. And so, but as I mentioned earlier, any kind of but certain amount of pumping in certain places could have the effect of affecting stream flow and spring flow. So that's a concern that's been raised.
Along the Devil's River specifically?
Yeah, depending if that's depending on the location and the amount.
Right.
But certainly that is.
Okay.
Some of the proposals have been offered were located in such a way that certainly would be a concern.
Right, okay. And my last question, and I was thinking about this as we were coming in this morning, it's a little broader scope than just the Devil's River, but I know a number of the springs you were referring to here in Val Verde County, they flow into Lake Amistad, and then, of course, that is on the Rio Grande. And there's been a lot of, articles and whatnot over the last number of years about downstream users along the Rio Grande and the availability of water. How does this issue, if there's any connection as far as the availability of water downstream along the Rio Grande, how does this play into making sure that there is water available downstream to the users that have permits? And how many downstream users are there, if you know?
I don't know the answer to how many downstream users, but there's a significant number. And of course, the lower Rio Grande Valley depends almost entirely on the Rio Grande and a number of communities. I'm sure Laredo does and other communities. But certainly going back to the question of if there were groundwater development or pumping in Val Verde County that reduced the spring flow and stream flow into the Rio Grande, certainly that would be an issue that would need to be looked at, because there are certain flow amounts that are dependent upon, and that gets into a legal area that I'm not that familiar with. But there are consequences to pumping groundwater in Val Verde County.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Larry. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Anybody else have any questions?
Mr. Chairman.
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. French, for being here today and for the work you did on these models and that type of thing. Do we know How many, I saw it, how many endangered species we have there along the Devils River, more or less?
There are several, and I would need to defer to the Parks and Wildlife folks on the exact number, but there are a number of them, multiple, I think minnows and other aquatic and probably some terrestrial
Yeah,
species as well.
I read something there. And have there been any studies about whether or not they think that groundwater pumpage would affect those species or not?
I know the Parks and Wildlife Department, I believe Nature Conservancy, those organizations have been conducting studies that address that kind of question.
Yeah.
And we looked a little bit at those as they would impact a groundwater study, but not directly.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. French.
Sure. I know that the Parks and Wildlife folks, a couple of years ago when we came out, they were in discussions with U.S. Fish and Wildlife as far as the listing of some of those species, and then that starts evolving to where you can start looking at what they did with the Edwards, trying to protect any of those species. So I like the study. I know there's been a number of studies over the last 3 decades out here, and different engineering companies have come out and looked at it, made assessments based on the modeling that was available at that point. I'm glad we've got something called the Val Verde model, and it looks at San Felipe Springs, looks at the Devils River, and for sustainability in the event we do get into a situation where we've got a significant decline in the Devils and then it does threaten those species. You don't want the federal court to come in. I can tell you from an area that has been subject to a decree by the federal courts, it's almost unmerciful as far as the impacts to the landowner rights as well as the people that are using it. So hopefully this will be a stimulus for folks to have an open dialogue about where we want to go forward. And I would assume that the representative from this area is looking at a groundwater conservation district like we've seen for the last 9 sessions, but it was all based on the PGMA and having all the information. So we appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
I've got a couple questions.
Okay.
Looking at page 4 of, can everybody hear me? Looking at page 4 of the findings, the bullet point, it says groundwater levels in areas away from Amistad Reservoir show no particular trend. Can you be a little bit more specific about that outside the, beyond the confines of the report?
Right. Well, so what we've looked at is we looked at, for the most part, annual measurements, and we looked at them, and they do have some variation, but we looked at kind of larger trends. We also looked at at one of the pages there, I don't have it, it's page 6, the slide, which has the graph of 2 wells. And those wells are providing continuous data over the last 10 years or more. And one's a deep well, one's a shallow well. They're both very close to the Devils River. And as you can see, they're pretty flat. And so that's been the basis of our statement that we feel that throughout the county, those 2 locations, and then in conjunction with other locations we've seen, we think that the groundwater levels have been fairly stable. Now, the one exception to that would be if you look at wells that are very close to Amistad Reservoir. As that reservoir was filled, we saw an increase in water levels reflecting the filling of that reservoir in that local area.
And another finding in the report talks about how the reservoir influences groundwater elevations in the springs, both, it says including San Felipe Springs, so I imagine some of the other springs that are fairly close to the reservoir, correct?
Right. In our report, we have kind of we outlined an area that we believe is under the influence of that reservoir, but we do believe that San Felipe Springs have been the flow in there has been influenced by the filling of the reservoir.
And for the benefit of those people that may not understand how that influence is, meaning it would seem very simple that if the reservoir is down, then that would mean the springs are down, correct?
That could affect it. There's probably a lag time, I'm sure, that's associated with that.
Okay, that's something that we can see. Now tell me how that actually works in terms of the actual influence when the reservoir is down, how that would actually influence the springs. Does that make sense?
Right. So you imagine before a reservoir was filled, the water was essentially, the Rio Grande was basically like a drain in that sense. So as you filled up that reservoir, and I don't know exactly how many feet deep it is, but it's probably 100 or more feet in many locations. That water then kind of invaded the surrounding rock and then just kind of basically raised water levels up above where they normally would be, and then that extended out to a certain period of influence. And so that, so as the water level fluctuates in the lake, it's going to be a lag time as it's connected to the reservoir, the aquifer reservoir, that is. There's going to be a lag time, but we have seen that they do track. And the spring flow is affected because springs are basically points where the aquifer basically leaks out onto the land surface. And so as you have a higher pressure in the aquifer, you're going to have a greater flow. If it drops below a certain level, as we've seen in other parts of the state, then basically the springs will stop flowing because the level of the groundwater level will be below that surface point in elevation.
You know, you bring up an interesting point because let's say, you know, obviously there was a point in time, and I'm not old enough to remember that point in time, and I'm not saying that other people are old by their nature, but just a fact, is there was a time when the reservoir did not exist, and whatever levels of spring they were affected by this effect that you're talking about, the river being a sponge or a drain, correct?
Right, it was a low point, so that's
Okay.
where things
And
go.
so the expectation of what the spring flow would look like didn't have anything to do with the reservoir because it did not exist. It just had to do with the effect of the river being a drain, correct? And so fast forward to where we are now, we have now, because the next part of that finding, and again, it's just generally, is that reservoir water has progressively mixed with groundwater in the area east of the lake over time, correct?
Right.
And so, no matter how we slice it, there's no going back in terms of saying, okay, well, the springs would have looked like this anyway if the reservoir did not exist, correct? We have to deal with the cards or the hand that we've dealt, correct?
Right, and that's what we've kind of incorporated kind of our groundwater management area. The reservoir is there, it's going to stay there, and so we would want to incorporate that feature within any kind of management system.
And I don't want to put words in your mouth in terms of what progressively mixed with the groundwater means, but is that what you just described before in terms of, you know, pre-reservoir and post-reservoir?
Right. I mean, it's a phenomenon that takes place over time. It wasn't at all instantaneous or even a short period of time. It takes a while for even groundwater to move, physically move in these areas and mix. So and when I say mixing, we were looking primarily at water chemistry data and looking at comparing chemistry of the lake or the reservoir water, for example, and the groundwater level, and see how that's changed over time. So
Now,
that's kind of the basis of our statement there.
And it seems, again, that based on the findings, and again, you have, you know, the recommendation that the county be broken up into management zones, correct?
That we offer that as a potential option. Yeah.
And when you say potential option, looking at the different options, or, I mean, I guess you could put many permutations of options together
Certainly.
for management zones. Would you agree that your zone plan, as opposed to some of the other ones, is based on reasonable scientific probability, or is it just a possible plan? I mean, tell us the difference for those that don't know.
Well, the zones that we identified here, we base those basically on watersheds primarily, with the exception of the Amistad, which is sort of an watershed based. I mean, those features are going to remain. Those are not going to be transient. Those watersheds. So that was one important kind of consideration that we used in terms of you know, if we're going to put a line on a map, for example,
Sure.
we thought that watersheds, because they have unique and special characteristics that probably would call for both different kind of scientific evaluation and maybe even other policy considerations. What works for the Pecos River, for example, would not be maybe not necessarily the right set of either data or possibly policy choices that might work for example, Lake Springs, for example. So we looked at what are the features that are permanent, if you will, you know, and the watersheds are, and so we thought that was at least one way to look at management zones. Other districts have looked at vertical differences, which we don't think are in play here. So there's other ways that can be looked at, and there could be other number of zones if you want.
And just kind of to wrap up my train of thought on this is, in the end, or not, at the bottom of page 4, when you're talking about your findings and you're describing the amount of work that's been done to correlate aquifer levels to stream flows, and it says limited amount of work, correct?
Right. As a scientist, we always find ways we'd like to know more, but
And I'm not criticizing saying you didn't do something. What I'm getting at is, as we go forward, it's to our benefit and the benefit of landowners and all the stakeholders to continue the work to see how these things actually correlated. If we can ever really get to a point where we can say, aha, it works just like this, correct?
that would be a nice place to get to. And I think there's certainly been a great deal of, in the last 10 years, I'd say there's been a great number of steps forward in understanding how groundwater and surface water work there.
And understanding this, and just because I understand this part of it, is anything that is concreted in a groundwater management district regarding aquifer levels and stream flows and curtailments and things of that nature, and the amount of pumping that one can do or can't do will be in some form or fashion affected by the amount of work that continues in this area, correct?
Right. We would, as districts do their work, the ones we've seen use the data and the science to help inform their decisions on permitting wells and doing their other kind of management decisions.
And I'm a lawyer by trade, so sometimes my questions are somewhat, for lack of a better word, not good. Let's put that. And I went to private school a lot, so I'm not very smart. But it seems that a little bit of flexibility in terms of how these things are going to work, and I'm talking about from a statutory standpoint, from the creation of a groundwater district under, let's just say we continue to work under Chapter 36 and we do something under Chapter 36. We're going to need that flexibility all the way around so that we can keep getting to a point where, people are satisfied that the process itself is fair in terms of how much pumping can be done, what kind of permits are given, and that everybody has a say in how it goes. Would that be fair to say?
The districts are certainly within the state. Local control is the important principle that's used. And so when we come in at the Water Development Board, we're here to provide science, any kind of technical assistance, but we definitely want to stay away as an agency from any kind of policy decisions. That's for a local folks to decide.
And that's my point, is us being able to parse this out, that the work that's been done so far is not work. We're not working towards a policy. We're working to just try to figure out what we've got in front of us, correct?
That's what our goal has been to do, yes.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Our next person to give testimony will be Bo Nettleton. Commissioner, you want to come up? State your name and the organization you represent. Either way. There you go.
Got it.
You can take it off the mic if you want to.
All right, thank you. My name is Bo Nettleton. I'm a County Commissioner, Precinct 3. I've been involved in this process for basically the last 16 years. The 9 bills that you've talked about, we started many, many years ago looking at this and trying to come up with a mechanism of how we deal with creating a groundwater district in Val Verde County. And I can tell you from my experience through all of these processes, we spent a lot of money. The county and the city came together and created this study, the Val Verde study, which has a lot of good data in it. The thing that's kept us from getting there is it hasn't been science-based, it's been emotion-based. We have numerous different stakeholders who have interests in this, and everybody has a right to have an interest in this. And the landowners need to protect their rights, the rivers need to protect their rights, and the communities need to protect their rights. And somewhere in the middle of all of this is the answer. As we look at the interaction, as Mr. French said, between groundwater and surface water in this county, it's very apparent that that the groundwater has a huge effect. So as part of the stakeholders in this is the state of Texas, since the state of Texas owns the surface water rights. And there's there's people downriver that have an effect on what happens in Val Verde County. So in my opinion, to get to a district, you have to take the emotions out and put the science into it. You know, I believe that the state needs to come in and start looking at groundwater on a regional basis and a statewide basis. They have to get engaged because it's their rivers that are going to be affected by whatever happens in a groundwater district that has, and similar here, since we have so many different rivers flowing through here. The state has an effect, which then has an effect downstream into the Gulf of Mexico and everything else. So we have to come up, and it was great to hear what Mr. French said on these management areas. I've always believed that's the way you manage Val Verde County. Living here all my life, you see the differences in how this county functions. I think it is a great approach. It's one that we looked at probably in the second bill that was filed as managing it and setting it up by these districts. I think it's a great approach, but everybody has to come to the table and realize that there's probably no winners in this, as many as there are losers. And there was some things mentioned that I think some of y'all have said about us looking at. I'd heard some conversations about maybe we approach the protection of the rivers the same way we approach protection of our Air Force bases. We buy encroachment rights. We come in and we buy the rights to develop water to protect those interests. And maybe that's something we look at in the legislation or wherever this thing goes in the future, is giving those authorities so that the locals or the state or somebody has those rights to protect those long-term interests. But we have to get past all the emotions, and I understand the emotions. I'm a landowner, and I believe that I have the right to do on my property what I need to do. But I also understand that you have to watch the effect on everything else. And so there's been so much distrust in this process over the last 16 years that we've grown so far apart on being able to come together because of things that have happened. It's become very difficult to get everybody back to the table to understand that we need to rehab this conversation. And so it's one that I guess continues to happen, but I believe the long-term management of groundwater, because of the issues with surface water and all the other stuff, have to be managed by the state. They have to be managed by a agency like the Water Development Board that bases their decisions off of science and not emotions, so that it is managed in a way that protects the landowners' rights, protects the rivers, and protects all the other people. And that's what I believe we ultimately have to get to. Doesn't mean we don't create a district and then work toward the ultimate goal, but I think ultimately that's where we have to get to, because whatever happens here is going to affect Eagle Pass, Laredo, McAllen, everybody all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico. And whatever happens above us in this aquifer has an effect on all those people. And when you look at the Pecos and the Rio Grande, what happens in El Paso and all the way up through Colorado has an effect on what happens below us. So we have to start looking at this a lot more regional, a lot more globally, in my opinion. And I do appreciate y'all coming to Del Rio and spending some time down here. It's nice that y'all came when we're talking about water and rain.
Yeah, definitely. Anybody have any questions for Commissioner Nutt? We went out and visited the Devil's River yesterday, and the headwaters, I guess, they've descended down to the Pecan Springs area. And the folks that took us out there talked about the river and the flows above it, and now it's all underground. And so you got a struggling river there, based on the fact the miles of the Devil's that is basically all the springs aren't flowing north of that or west of that, or whatever the geography is. So, I mean, you've been here your entire life, so tell me how much of that river have we lost in your lifetime?
Well, when I was a kid, I mean, and I know more about it from my parents when they were kids. They were born in 1914 and 1920s, and they used to go up from where the head of the Devil's River is now, they used to go up to Beaver Lake, and they would play there where there was a springs and the river would flow. And, I mean, this was a long time ago. And when I had and it's not just that river that we see those effects on. When my dad bought our place in 1944, the gentleman he bought it from said that the dry riverbed that runs through us quit running as a river in about 1896 to 1897. And then as you see the continual development of groundwater resources above us as growth happens, you see the continual amount of cedar and mesquite that is growing up in this country and taking that recharge away from the ability to recharge those aquifers. You see those levels drop. You know, it's not just a population issue. There's other issues that stop recharge. You know, cedar has taken over. I can remember my parents talking when they first bought that ranch, there was very little cedar on it. And now it's completely covered up. And those are issues that we have to look at too if you want to increase recharge, is how do we deal with those issues long term? You know, as long you do conservation and others, but yes, we've lost quite a bit of the Devil's River over years. But when I was a kid, where the current springs are is where it's always been. It's flowed that way. It's a beautiful river. My parents had a fishing lease on the Husbands River Ranch where the springs are now, and I spent most of my life playing up and down there. It's a beautiful river. And, you know, drought has an effect on it. When we see large rains, you'll see that river flow even further up north for quite a while before it finally dissipates back down into the gravel beds. And then if you have a good wet year, it'll flow through some of those dry crossings for quite a while.
Thanks for your testimony. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Chair recognizes J.R. McBee. Mr. McBee, state your name and who you represent. You can do it there if you want to.
Well, I might fall asleep there, but my name's J.R. McBee. I'm a sixth-generation landowner here in Val Verde County. Like Mr. Nettleton, been involved in this groundwater creation effort, district creation efforts for the past 16-plus years now, I guess. Recognize all of you guys, see y'all once every 2 years, it seems like, for the last several decades. But appreciate y'all coming out here. You know, really, I don't have a whole lot to say. I just, you know, my main concern is our past district creation efforts. I just didn't feel treated the landowner. It didn't recognize our private property rights sufficiently. It didn't treat people fairly and equitably. That's why we could never really get to a consensus with the city. You know, all of our population is pretty much right here in Del Rio and within the ETJ. We're one of the largest counties in the state. We have over 3,000 square miles. And, you know, I just don't feel that the way that this thing was going to be structured in the last efforts were, you know, adequately represented the landowners' rights. But I'm certainly not against the district. I think that there's still a lot of science that needs to come. I appreciate Mr. French's report. I read all 152 pages of it. Realize I'm not a scientist for sure. But, you know, I think that did a good job of consolidating a bunch of the work that's already been done by others. And it you know, it's really eye-opening. I thought there was some good information in there. I do still think that there needs to be a lot more science done. We have such a unique situation here in our county. You know, I don't have to repeat what's already been said. It's obvious. And y'all know that. Y'all been out here enough, too, to see it. We own 7 miles of river frontage along the Devil's River and have since the late 1800s. So, you know, pretty familiar with that. It is a beautiful, you know, it's a pretty spot in Texas as far as I'm concerned. So appreciate y'all doing that. So, and personally, I'm not against trying to get to a groundwater district. I don't think that we need to create one just for the sake of creating one. I saw some rumblings about a priority groundwater management area. I don't even think we meet the criteria for that, but I don't know, that's above my pay grade. But that certainly scares me. I agree with Commissioner Nettleton. I mean, I think that local control is probably not the best way for our deal to work out here in this part of the world. We just can't seem to get from point A to point B on that. So, but really, that's all I have. I just want to make sure that we keep our finger on the pulse on this deal and try to work together to get to a good point. It's like Representative King told me at the last meeting. He said, he's tired of seeing us. So.
I wasn't quite that bad, I hope. I
have a different recollection.
I think I apologized afterward, too, didn't I?
Yeah, you finally did a couple years later. We're all good. But anyway, I'd certainly like to answer any questions if y'all have some.
Yeah, it's sort of a contrast. Most folk would prefer local control versus state control. And if you look at it from the hill country, and we heard a lot of testimony in dealing with San Saba, you know, in dealing with the river and having the same exact issues as far as the groundwater influence on the surface. And when they start watering those pecan trees, they see a diminishment of flow, and the in-stream flow has been compromised for multiple years now. And so it's the same dialogue. And they were advocating something similar. They were saying, look at the hydrology. The issue out here is the population is all right here in Del Rio, and so you create a district, the property owners aren't going to get the representation. And so I don't know how we get around the voting, the whole Voting Act issue as far as, you know, who would make the decisions. And I think Del Rio, last time we had a representative, I think the mayor came up and spoke on their behalf, and they weren't willing to sit down and negotiate with the property owners because their focus is where their water's coming from in the springs there. So,
Well, that's exactly right. And I don't want to rehash old times on this deal, but yeah, there were quite a few issues. But that's one of our big concerns, is just having a potential lack of any representation. And you know, it is a private.
Do you agree with the study that Mr. French laid out, that there is an influence on the Devils? You got 7 miles of frontage that the groundwater influence with the Devils. And do you agree with that?
Well, it's obvious that there's an interaction there. I mean, I'm not a scientist, but you know, I know of a bunch of springs and such just along our part there. I mean, it's obvious it's coming from up out of the ground.
From
so.
the ground, yeah.
But you know, I like the concept of potentially doing the different management areas, because I think that our county is so diverse. You know, just the topography and the hydrogeology. I mean, it's you can drive from here to Langtree and it's a whole different. You know, it's like being in a whole different area. So I mean, I kind of like that concept. You know, the main issue, like I say, is just the, you know, we want to be treated equitably. I mean, it's a private property right. The rule of capture is what we have now. I mean, I'm not looking to go drill a big well and do anything, but I mean, you go from that to where they're saying there's, you know, you can only do this or that, and it's quite, you know, it's a hard pill to swallow if you, especially if you don't feel like you're going to have any say in the management of it. And that's what I think our concerns have been in the past.
Thank you, Mr. B. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Chair recognizes Randy Nuns. Randy, if you come up and state your name and what organization you represent.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Randy Nuns. I'm a local landowner. I also am the president of the Devils River Conservancy. I wonder if I should raise this a little bit. I'd like to thank the committee, the chairman, and the members for making this visit. I know Del Rio's not the easiest place to get to. Also like to thank the Texas Water Development Board for doing a lot of heavy lifting on that report. It's a lot of work. And I also like to thank my county commissioners for working those roads. I had a good road to drive in today because they were already working them after this big rain we had. But I would like to clarify one rumor about Devils River landowners. We don't shoot at paddlers like we've been accused of. We practice catch and release. That's what we do.
Wow.
So.
That's comforting.
Yeah. I did prepare some handouts. I'm an Aggie, and so I do better with pictures. And so that's what I've supplied you all to kind of illustrate some of my points about what I think, and I'm kind of parroting what a lot of other people said, that it's just common sense to manage a hydrologic resource by hydrologic features. You know, rather than geopolitical boundaries, doesn't make any sense to hydrology and water flows. So management zones, I think, are the only way. And I think that does a couple of things. It gives landowners like JR more say in his region, in his zone. And it gives the policymakers flexibility, or some people call it adaptive management, because Representative Navarro said that, things change. And we always need more science. That's always the final statement on every scientific study. More study needs to be done. So we're very protective over the Devil's River. I think just about anybody who's been on it, they come back just smitten, and everybody's got an opinion about it. But there's a lot of other special places in the state of Texas. We'd like to think that maybe ours is most special, but, there's the Big Bend, there's the Piney Woods, Big Thicket, and so forth. But let me just point out a few things that really make Val Verde County unique. You go to that first page, you see within Val Verde County, there are 3 ecological regions that overlap right there. So you have the Tamaulipan brush country from the south, Edwards Plateau from the east, and then the Chihuahuan Desert. And they all have that nexus right here, pretty much in the Devil's Valley. So what does that mean? Well, it's incredible biodiversity. Where else in the state do you have 3 species of quail? There may be, but we've got the Montezuma quail, we've got the blues, scale quail, and bobs right here. Hooded orioles from the valley. I've got them hanging their little woven nest right on my eaves at the house. We got 2 species of horny toads. We've got the regular Texas horned lizard, and then we've got the roundtail. So that's kind of an illustration of how special the land is. So moving on, you can look at the report from the Texas Water Development Board, just the map of Val Verde County and the amount of precipitation. There's a big variance from the eastern side to the far western side, almost double. So if we're talking about recharge and so forth, again, it's just calling out management zones. Now the next page is really interesting, as we're talking about catchment areas, recharge, and springs and so forth. So this map shows a lot of the springs. We know a lot of the major ones, but there's a whole lot more than I can't recall. But who thinks the Pecos contributes more water to the Rio Grande than the Devils? It doesn't. But look at the catchment area in that little insert box. According to the International Boundary Water Commission, the catchment area of the Pecos River is 44,000 square miles. Look at the catchment area for the Devils, 3,900 square miles. But the Devils produces more contribution to the Rio Grande. So what does that tell us? A lot of groundwater, like we've heard. So the next page, you can see a map that we put out because we're dealing with encroachment of some Chinese investors who put up a wind farm. But I want to make the point that there's a whole lot of conservation work that's already been done in Val Verde County, especially in the Devils. Those areas in green represent over 150,000 acres that were voluntarily put under conservation easements. Some of those have been transferred now to Texas Parks and Wildlife, but most of that was started by the Nature Conservancy. You'll be hearing from them in a minute, but some of it's from the Texas Agricultural Land Trust, TALT, and others. So I'd like to draw some kind of analogy. There's a lot of interconnectivity that we're talking about between groundwater and surface water, and we all know it's interconnected, but we are interconnected with our neighbors as well. And I think I'm real proud of our organization of trying to draw in all of our neighbors to the common cause and to the higher causes. So these folks that have put their family ranches under conservation easements are really helping out not just their family and future generations, but their neighbors. And I think that's what we have to think about with a lot of policy is our children's children. What are we doing? So I live right across, or I don't live there, but my property on the Devils looks at a big ranch that's under conservation easement. And it helps, at least personally, my property value, even though I'll never sell it. But that's a really nice thing. Conversely, if somebody, for profit reasons, pumps out all the groundwater and dries up some springs or makes me having to drill a deeper well, that's not the kind of neighbor I like to have. So that's what we're trying to get to is culturally interconnectivity within our neighbors. So it was mentioned that there have been proposals in the past. If you go to the next page, there's several entrepreneurs that would like to do pipelines. That first one, the VV Water Company, I believe they were in the top 3 finalists for SAWS to build a pipeline to San Antonio. But they'd be just as happy doing a pipeline to the Permian Basin and taking that sweet water to frack with, or just supply man camps. So that's a consideration. You look at the next page, and there's another company named Heritage Commodity, same aspirations, and there's others for sure. So let's move on. There was a mention of endangered species, and Parks and Wildlife and Nature Conservancy biologists can certainly address this more, but we feel that Texas ought to maintain the resources and avoid having the feds come in and with their heavy hand tell us how to manage for these species. The most recent listed species that happened this year is the Texas hornshell mussel. That I really didn't know anything about. Who gets excited about mussels? You don't see them, you step on them probably, but this one is endangered. It's in the Devils. But what we're finding out now, as far as determining river quality, mussels are the canary in the coal mine. They're filter feeders. And I put in excerpts from the Fish and Wildlife listing that says both the Texas hornshell mussel and the Devil's River minnow, which is threatened, is not endangered, but they both depend on surface water quality and quantity for their survival. So can we keep Fish and Wildlife Service out of here? Let's keep those springs flowing and get these species into recovery. So I guess to finish up, we like the idea of the management zones. The proof is in the pudding and how all the regulations are written up. But, and we do like the idea of triggers. If there's plenty of water, plenty of groundwater, and I hope there is, people that would like to market the water should be okay with some triggers. You know, if they say there's that much water to sell it elsewhere, all right, let's put in some reasonable triggers, but let's not necessarily make it the aquifer alone. Let's make it the stream flow. Let's make sure Eagle Pass gets some of that Rio Grande water that comes out of the ground in Devil's River. And I forgot to put this in a little earlier. The headwaters was up at Juneau of the Devils. As stated in the Texas Water Development Board report from 1975, Gunnar Brune has the Bible on Texas Springs. And He said it was a Juneau, but, and Beaver Lake was a landmark for the explorers, the conquistadors, the Comanches, and everybody else, but it had since moved 15 miles south. The headwaters, that is, has moved from the Juneau Springs 15 miles south to the Pecan Springs on the Hudspeth River Ridge. And so the observation that they were flowing was 1916. So Larry was right. In the last 100 years, it's been consistently Pecan Springs, but don't know exactly when the Juneau Springs dried up. But let's kind of keep Pecan Springs as the headwaters. And who knows, with some kind of management like Commissioner Nettleton said about the brush control and wise use of the groundwater, maybe we can move it back up a little bit. So thank you, and I can take any questions if there are any.
Anybody have any questions for Randy? Thank you for hosting us yesterday. Thank you.
Bet. My pleasure.
Chair recognizes Jeff Weigel. Jeff, you come up and just state your name and what organization you represent.
Thank you, Chairman Larson. I'm Jeff Weigel. I'm the Director of Strategic Initiatives for the Nature Conservancy here in Texas. And I brought a map too. I'll hand it up here. And I think we're going to put that up on the screen as well.
Yeah, go ahead.
Should we go ahead? Okay. Well, thank you for having me here today to speak on Interim Charge 3G relating to groundwater and surface water interaction. First, a little bit about the Nature Conservancy. We're the world's largest conservation organization. We work in about 70 countries around the world. We're directed by science. We use science-based solutions to help create a world where both people and nature can better thrive. And as a landowner here in Val Verde County, and a partner with many of the folks in this room, we've been working to protect land and water around the Devil's River for almost 30 years now. This morning, I'm going to briefly describe our protection history along the Devil's River, and the map will kind of be your guide to that. And then also review some of the work we're doing on the Devils and elsewhere in Texas on issues relating to groundwater and surface water interaction. The Conservancy first started its land protection work here in the Devils in the early 90s. Since the very beginning, we've used land-based tools such as direct ownership, but also conservation easements to achieve a water-related outcome, protecting the Devils River, one of the most pristine rivers in Texas. And as you've heard from some of the other folks, the Devils supports many endangered and threatened species, as well as municipal and agricultural communities. Today, the Conservancy owns about 5,000 acres in Val Verde, which is called our Dolan Falls Preserve. We think it's one of the finest places in Texas, and we're very proud to protect that. And with our partners, our landowner partners, we protected an additional 140,000 acres or so, mostly through conservation easements, and that's kind of what your map shows there. Conservation easements are one of the most important tools that we use to protect natural resources in Texas. They're voluntary. Landowners agree to permanently protect their land and limit development of their property. Chairman Larson, as you know, we've used conservation easements to great success in other areas of the state to protect our aquifer resources. The Edwards Aquifer Protection Program in and around San Antonio uses both land purchase and easements to protect the water quality in the Edwards Aquifer, which provides San Antonio with much of its drinking water. Here in Val Verde County, we've primarily used private funds and donations to protect the land surrounding the Devil's River. And some of our easements, really most of our easements, do restrict commercial development of water. When we first started working there almost 30 years ago on the Devils, our focus was really on preserving land and some of those natural resource values, but we felt like that also protected the Devils River in a way. But over time, we realized that in order to protect the delicate and pristine water resources, we had to better understand it, how it's used, and what the river needs to support its systems. Since then, we've sought to facilitate and develop the science needed to better understand the Devils River, from the aquifer that feeds it to the river ecosystem and the human uses derived from it. Our goal is to help create the conditions in which we can sustainably manage the water in the Devils River. We believe that we can balance the needs of the river and the environment with the downstream municipal and agricultural communities that also depend on this water. Over the years, we've assisted with development of more than a dozen key water monitoring stations in the basin, which produce data that are vital to developing our understanding of the river, including the development of the recent groundwater models that you heard about. We've also facilitated key research on the aquifer, groundwater flow to springs, spring ecosystems, the river ecosystem, and the endangered species. We're currently working with the Texas Parks and Wildlife Department and others to fill out groundwater surface water science in the Devils River Basin. This project seeks to connect the dots between recent advances in modeling the Devils River watershed, allowing us to better understand the groundwater surface water interactions, spring flow, and river flow needs of the ecosystem and its rare species. So while we're here in Val Verde County today, the way that groundwater and surface water interact with each other is a challenge for water management in many areas of Texas. As you've heard us say in front of this committee many times, as we deal with our water scarcity challenges, we believe that we can find a way to balance the water needs of industry, cities, and agriculture while still protecting the environment. To do so, we must improve the way we use water and use less of it, and we continue to need science and solutions that help accomplish those goals. I'd like to take a little time to describe some of the work we're doing in other parts of the state to better understand surface water, groundwater interactions. At your last hearing in Brady, you heard about some of the challenges that the San Saba River faces. Here we've begun the first phase of a groundwater and surface water hydrologic study for the San Saba River. This study includes data collection and long-term monitoring sites at multiple locations within the river, in addition to groundwater wells in both the Edwards Trinity Aquifer and alluvial aquifers. We hope that collecting this information over time will help inform our understanding of aquifer dynamics, river gains and losses, and groundwater and surface water interactions throughout the basin. This research will allow us to support water management strategies that are backed by strong science, balance the needs of multiple water users, and support the ecological integrity of the San Saba River. Closer to here, out in the Balmorhea and Fort Stockton area, we've expanded our efforts to develop groundwater and surface water monitoring efforts to provide data to inform sustainable energy development. Here's a couple examples. At our Sandia Springs Preserve near Balmorhea, we're working to understand how 2 of the springs of the Balmorhea Spring Complex are recharged and how this could be affected by energy development in the region. And at our Diamond Y Preserve, just north of Fort Stockton in Pecos County, we facilitated important research and monitoring related to a complex suite of aquifers to support one of the area's only remaining springs and understand the reasons for its recent decline. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today. We look forward to being a resource to the committee as we continue to demonstrate an interdependent relationship between surface water and groundwater and the need for solutions to balance water use and protect the environment. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. Anybody have any questions? I thank you for your leadership and your involvement out here in Val Verde County.
Thank you.
That's going to close out that portion. We're going to go to a panel to discuss the Val Verde County issue, and I'm going to call them up. Ron Green, Robert Mace, and Steve Young. If y'all could come up. Morning. Morning. Steve, why don't you start it out, and you can just state your name and what organization you work with.
Thank you.
You might need to move that microphone a little closer. Yeah.
Thank you.
There you
Have
go.
slides. Okay. And Chairman Larson and members of the committee, thank you for this opportunity to provide testimony. For the record, my name is Steve Young, and I'm the principal geoscientist at Intera Incorporated. Intera is a hydrogeologic engineering firm in Austin, Texas. I have provided my prepared remarks to the committee. I'll be reading these now. From a statewide perspective, the proper understanding of surface groundwater interaction is important to the management of water rights along a river, the Endangered Species Act compliance, environmental flows, and better bank permits. To help support my testimony, I would use 2 slides to illustrate some hydrogeologic terms important to the discussion of surface groundwater interactions. The first slide, shows illustrations of gaining and losing streams. A gaining stream is where groundwater flows into a stream. A losing stream is where surface water flows into an aquifer. Surface groundwater interaction can change relatively quickly in response to changes in stream elevation. In the second slide, the figure on the left shows stream flows entering the riverbank because of a temporary rise in the stream elevation. The stored water in the riverbank is called bank storage. The figure on the right, the bank storage that leaves the aquifer and enters the rivers as the stream level recedes is called bank flow. My interest in groundwater surface water interactions began when I served as a project manager for the El Saws Water Project, Groundwater for Agriculture Study. Surface groundwater interaction would be proved to be an important physical process to understand and model for that project. The studies and data analysis describing surface groundwater interactions between the Colorado River and aquifers within GMA 15 was conflicting and lacked clarity for developing a detailed groundwater model. To fill that need, the El Saws Water Project conducted a series of studies over a 5-year period to greatly improve their understanding of surface groundwater interactions with the Colorado River. These studies included installing and monitoring wells in the river gauges, performing gain-loss studies of inflow and outflow to a river, and performing surface groundwater modeling of surface groundwater interactions. These studies led to the following important conclusions. Several historical gain-loss studies were flawed because of improper accounting of diversion and return flows. The Colorado River was primarily a gaining stream. Bank flow can be a significant component of groundwater flow into a stream. The GAM's ability to simulate groundwater surface water interaction needed improvement, and the El Saws model demonstrated how that could be done. The current GAM was incorrectly overpredicting the impacts of deep groundwater pumping on surface water flow. The realization that a large amount of data and sophisticated analysis are required to properly monitor surface groundwater interaction is a core message provided not only from the El Saws studies, but also from a 2007 TWDB report and a 2005 TCEQ report. Stakeholder interest in improving the understanding of surface water groundwater interaction is evidenced by a recent study in GMA 12. On the contract to TWDB, Intera worked with 7 entities who contributed more than $500,000 to the TWDB GAM program to improve a GAM to better simulate impacts of geologic faults and to better simulate groundwater surface water interactions. The funding entities included 4 GCDs, 2 river authorities, and the Colorado Lavaca Bebas group. GMA 12 includes both the Colorado and Brazos rivers. With regard to the Colorado River, there's been lawsuits challenging district permits and petitions challenging the GMA DFCs on the grounds that groundwater pumping impacts on surface water are not being properly considered as required by Section 36-108C of the Texas Water Code. With regard to the Brazos River Basin, recent curtailment and establishment of a water master program has heightened awareness of groundwater pumping in the Brazos River alluvium. And Robertson, Brazos, and Burleson County, pumping has exceeded 100,000 acre-feet for several years. The amount of pumping in the Brazos alluvium could go up based on recently developed values for the groundwater availability model that exceed 2,000 acre-feet. Excuse me, that was the developed values for the MAG, the groundwater availability groundwater. Questions regarding the availability of either water from the Brazos River or groundwater from the Brazos River alluvium would be benefited by a rigorous understanding of surface groundwater interactions. I have co-authored a paper that is currently in review by the Texas Water Journal, documenting observations and lessons learned from regarding groundwater surface interactions. My co-authors are Robert Mace, who will speak later, and Carlos Rubenstein, former chairman of the TWB and former commissioner of TCQ. The paper highlights issues that may have intentionally contributed to disputes about actual availability of water and its appropriate regulatory authority. A question central to resolving water availability is whether we have the right science to properly characterize groundwater surface water interaction. In our paper, we have identified obstacles that can hinder decision makers' ability to understand groundwater surface water interactions based on part on the Texas Water Code statutes, regulations, and permit requirements. These obstacles include imprecise language, lack of field studies that characterize surface groundwater interactions, and variable methods for analyzing of stream hydrographs, and inaccurate modeling of surface groundwater interactions in administrative tools. Because spring flows are a major component of the groundwater and surface water flows in Val Verde County, groundwater surface water is important, and the two resources are intimately linked in Val Verde County. This linkage is important to numerous water management issues, including management of Lake Amistad and recent and required international water accounting practices. The 1944 treaty and its associated minutes address the allocation of water availability to the United States and Mexico based on tributary flows into the lake and on groundwater surface water interaction, such as spring flow and leakage from Lake Amistad to underlying aquifers. Improved groundwater characterization in the region could be the basis for adjusting the water availability calculations and developing a sustainable management plan that is required by Minute 38 of the 1944 treaty. Again, thank you for this opportunity to testify to the committee. Development of better science to characterize and model surface groundwater interaction will benefit managers and regulators of water resources and will help protect our collective interest in water resources.
Thanks, Steve. Anybody have any questions for Steve? Appreciate your perspective, especially on the Brazos. I know there's a lot of pressure on that, and there's a lot of discussions right now of the irrigation and the municipal use over there. So, thank you.
Thank you.
Dr. Green, would you like to go next? Just state your name and the organization.
Thank you. My name is Ron Green. I'm a groundwater hydrologist, Southwest Research Institute. I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you, Mr. Chairman, and committee members. I made a presentation at the Brady hearing, and I elected not to just repeat that, but to bring some other material. And I was greatly interested in the Texas Water Development Board summary given by Mr. French. I hadn't had an opportunity to read that report or to peruse it. I found it quite interesting. I don't typically disagree with Mr. French, and in this case, we are both singing from the same songbook. I mean, we are right on the money. So,
You got a stamp of approval, Larry.
yeah. So after spending time out here with Vic Hildebrand, I feel I have to put some color into my comments just a little bit. So yeah. So, do you have my
Presentation.
Oh, it's in, there should be presentations and then Texas legislature.
You can go ahead and start.
Yeah, so I'll start. So the first slide actually is very similar to Steve's slide. And I'm talking, the title of my talk is Groundwater Surface Water Interaction in the Transboundary Area, focusing on the Texas Reach. And so what are these interactions? Well, there is a slide. The next slide, please. One more. Okay. This is a sort of a backup view that shows a larger area. It shows all the watersheds, the major surface watersheds that go down to the Rio Grande, and obviously surface watersheds do not cross the Rio Grande. But if you go to the next slide, when you look at aquifers, there are examples where aquifers do go underneath the Rio Grande and are transboundary. One nice example is the Edwards Trinity, and it's of great interest. We've heard a lot of comments on this. So going to the next slide, if we look at the Edwards Trinity, we see that the Edwards Trinity can be subdivided into a number of subbasins. And you've heard some of those discussed at different times, the Lower Pecos and the Devils River in particular, but there are others that would be of interest elsewhere. So going on to the watershed basin observations, we've done work on similar systems that have helped guide our understanding of what we see down here. And I'd like to just make a comment or two on the Edwards Aquifer. We did some work on this over the past 8 to 10 years, and what we found there is that the watersheds in the unconfined part of the aquifer up in the contributing zone act separately. So if you look at all those major watersheds from the Nueces to the Frio to the Medina to the Guadalupe, Cibolo, those watersheds up in the contributing zone do not communicate. And this is going to be very relevant when we start talking about some of the aquifers down here. So we brought that insight down over to the Edwards Trinity plateaus. So looking at the next cross section, what you see is that in those areas where the aquifer under the watershed is unconfined, those aquifers don't typically communicate hydraulically with their adjoining watersheds. However, once those aquifers get deeper and become semi-confined or confined, then they do communicate. And you see that over in the Edwards, so you get down the confined zone, all those watersheds communicate. Up in the contributing zone, they do not communicate. We see the same over in the Edwards Trinity. So if we now focus on the Amistad Reservoir area, and moving on to the next slide, Shannon, please. We see a map. It's a little bit different rendition of what we saw before, but we see the major watersheds that go down towards Amistad. And over on the west, we see the Pecos River. And because of all the activity and some naturally occurring issues, the lower Pecos can be treated as a separate entity, and we've modeled that separately. We see the Devils River watershed in the middle, and then we see down to the southeast, we see Sycamore Creek. And then there are a couple areas in white that are not really covered by those watersheds, but they certainly have an important bearing on what's going on down there, Amistad. In that slide, you can see the amount of contributions. Randy noted the significant amount of water coming out of the Devils River watershed relative to the Pecos. And once again, part of that is because the Pecos only gets water from the lower reach. You also have the Goodenough Springs. Next slide, please. And Goodenough Spring is now underneath Amistad. It has significant discharge. Where that water comes from in Goodenough isn't completely understood. Anecdotal evidence suggests it comes from Mexico. But it's in the mix. It's in the water budget for Amistad. So more needs to be understood about Goodenough Spring. Going on to the Pecos, I discussed that briefly a little bit, but the water that goes into Amistad from the lower Pecos is mostly from two tributaries. One is the Live Oak that goes up to the north. The other is Independence. And the fresh water of those is sufficient to improve the water quality in the Pecos coming out of Pecos County, which is very poor, so that the quality of water where the Pecos goes in Amistad is pretty good. It's about 1,000 milligrams per liter. It's much worse upstream. And that's naturally occurring, but it's probably exacerbated by a lot of the pumping and activities up in the upper reach. So going on to the next slide, you see that if you look at how much water gets down into the Amistad, only a small portion of that is derived from the upper reaches of the Pecos. So moving on to the Devils, I spoke about this at some greater detail at the Brady meeting. Moving on, there's just a one-slide summary on it. We've done a lot of work on this, characterizing the karst system and the relationship between groundwater and surface water. We understand why the larger capacity wells are located along the rivers, and it's because of this karst development. But we see that the Devils River watershed is a closed basin, so there's no communication hydraulically between the upper Devils and the Pecos to the west and the other systems to the east. So groundwater that's pumped within that basin will not impact those other watersheds, which is additional motivation to have separate triggers for separate watersheds. So just moving on, there's a slide that's a repeat of what I showed before, but now understanding why we're looking at it this way, you see that those watersheds in the upper part do not communicate. But when you get down to the next slide, please. Where they're confined, that's not the case. Now, once you get down closer to Amistad, those watersheds do communicate. And that's the area that Larry French showed a different management zone. I did not attempt to put it here, but I agree that that would be a good approach. The hydraulics of that is a little more challenging. We don't understand it. And if you look, I've added the capture areas of the major watersheds, and you can see that the Pecos is about 6,000 square miles. The Devils is 3,900, that was mentioned earlier. We don't know good enough because not enough work has been done on that, but that's down in Mexico. But look at the small area of San Felipe Springs. It gives 65,000 acre feet per year, but it's only 53 square miles. So what that tells us is water's coming from somewhere. Somewhere there is hydraulic communication down dip where it's confined. And we don't know exactly where that is. Additional work could be done to help understand that. So moving on, I talked just a little bit about triggers. And the two watersheds, the Pecos River, the Langtree Gauge, and the Devils River at Pafford Crossing would be appropriate triggers for those watersheds. You have a long record of measurements, mostly by the International Boundary and Water Commission, but they accurately reflect the water coming off those watersheds. Going to the next slide, you look at that lower area, and that's going to be a bit of a challenge. A good enough spring is in there. You're gaining water from that, but you don't know where it comes. But it doesn't appear that any activities of water management or pumping on the state side of the river is going to impact that. What impacts San Felipe Springs is a little bit unknown. We know that when the reservoir went in, it impacted it. So it does respond to that local influence. So with that, I have a summary slide, but I went through it pretty quickly. I could go through it, but I'll close there and open for any questions. Thank you.
Sure. Anybody have any questions for Dr. Green? Thanks. I appreciate the perspective. And now, Robert Mace.
Mr.
Thank
Chair.
you for coming down.
Sure.
Appreciate it.
My pleasure. I really appreciate the invitation. For the record, my name is Robert Mace. I'm Deputy Executive Director at the Meadow Center for Water and the Environment at Texas State University. I'm also a professor in the Geography Department at Texas State University. I'm teaching a class this semester on groundwater resources and management, so I get to indoctrinate youngsters. This is a wonderful place to talk about surface water, groundwater interaction. As we've heard all morning, we've got interactions with the Pecos River, surface water, groundwater interactions, Devils River. We've talked about Goodenough Springs and San Felipe Springs. Oftentimes when we talk about surface water and groundwater interaction, there's a spring or springs getting gored from pumping down here. When the reservoir went in, Lake Amistad, it appears that actually increased flow at San Felipe Springs, which is really fascinating how that reservoir appears to have affected spring flow in that springs. It's also very fascinating down here. I don't know if y'all, when you did your tour, if you're able to see the spring where Del Rio gets the water supply from. And it's a fantastic spring water, just a massive boil comes out of the ground. And then there's pipes that go down into that uprising of water and pulls water out for Del Rio. The way Texas groundwater law is that's groundwater, but as soon as it crosses, that threshold of the land surface, it becomes state water, it becomes surface water. My understanding is Del Rio has to have it has a surface water permit to produce that water. And so it's just that, if you saw that, you're literally looking at the legal and physiological interface between those water supplies there. Larry French talked earlier about there's a desired future condition for Val Verde County that's centered on San Felipe Springs. I just want to stress that although that desired future condition is focused on San Felipe Springs and maintaining a minimum flow of San Felipe Springs, without a groundwater district, it's not enforceable. So if there's not a regulatory authority that is managing to achieve that goal, it's rule of capture down here. So I just want to stress that. The desired future condition does have value, and then it does feed into the regional water planning process when the planning group is deciding where future water supplies are coming from, but there's no enforcement, local enforcement of that desired future condition. Just wanted to make some general comments on surface water, groundwater interaction. Given the Meadow Center's location on the Balcones Escarpment in San Antonio, we hear a lot from landowners and concerned stakeholders on issues on surface water, groundwater interactions. And we hear from landowners that are concerned, particularly if they're in headwaters of hill country streams, concerned about increased pumping and drying up those springs. But also more and more we're hearing about water quality concerns. And we've talked a little bit about water quality this morning, but there's water quality concerns in that, for example, on the Pecos River in Girvin, it hits a maximum salinity and then it freshens up as it flows towards the Rio Grande. And the reason it's freshening up is because there's fresher groundwater inflows coming into the river, and Ron pointed that out. But also, it goes the other way. And so if a stream is losing water to the aquifer, and that water in the stream is impaired, that can adversely affect water quality in the aquifer. One example is tests of water quality in the Edwards Aquifer in Wells, as well as at Comal and San Marcos Springs. There's detections of pharmaceuticals, so evidence that perhaps leaking sewage infrastructure or septic tanks is getting into the water supply. At San Marcos Springs, they actually found trace amounts of cocaine. So if you're wondering why we're always so peppy down there, that might be why.
Explains a lot.
Now, before anybody goes and tries to snort spring water, you will drown yourself before you get a buzz. It's trace amounts. Don't want to freak anybody out that there's pharmaceuticals in the water, but they're there and they're in trace amounts. You'd have to imbibe quite a bit of it. But they're there, and it's an indication that surficial activities, impaired surface water flows are getting into the aquifers. Kind of closer to the urbanizing areas in the hill country, there's more concerns that we're hearing about on wastewater treatment plants discharging to hill country streams, then leaking into the aquifer and showing up in residential wells. And there's been tracer tests that show, less than a day you can get water from a creek showing up in somebody's well. And so there's concerns about that. And with that, I'll conclude my comments and happy to take any questions that y'all might have. Thank you very much.
Anybody have any questions for Dr. Mace? Pancho?
No, Mr. Chairman, thank you all for participating, but I just want to let you know I'm heading out to San Antonio to that memorial, so I'll be leaving you guys. But I think the discussion on the groundwater part in particular, it never ceases to be interesting, but I really believe this to be true. I think we're heading in the right direction.
Said thank you for the invitation to come down here.
And again, thank each and every one of you for coming. I know it's a long way, but Del Rio is just a great place to visit. And I think yesterday, for those of us that saw the river, it was an awesome spectacle just to see the county itself, from up there and see the river. And you gotta marvel at what a great place this is, and it really is. And so, thank you all for coming, and enjoy the rest of the hearing.
Well, thanks, appreciate it. Appreciate all three of y'all testifying. I know the groundwater, surface water interaction issue, it's complicated and very difficult to regulate. I think that Mr. French laid out, exactly what's happening here, and then just got to see if there's the willingness to step forward and try to manage all the resources here. But I think the data's here. Everybody said that a good groundwater district formulation one is having the science first. And I think there's been a plethora of scientific studies that have taken place over the last couple of decades, and this is the culmination of it. So thank y'all very much.
Chairman, I'm
Yes.
sorry, before we lose this
Okay.
brain trust up there, San Felipe Springs, is that correct? What's the phenomenon there where we can't actually figure out the source, or are we chasing that down?
San Felipe Spring is actually a lot like the spring over in San Marcos in Comal. That's a Balcones fault type spring. It comes from depth. It's different than the springs upland in the upper watersheds of the Devils. Those are, I would call them gravity springs, where you just have permeable rock overlying impermeable rock where it intersects the surface. The water coming out at San Felipe is from some depth. Las Moras Spring is similar. Many of the springs along the Balcones Fault are similar, and that's why they call them Balcones Fault Springs. I think additional work could be done to help identify where that water comes from, but I don't know if that information and the understanding's there just yet.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Hey, thank y'all very much. That concludes the testimony on our first interim charge. We're going to move to interim charge 8, which studies the hazards presented by abandoned and deteriorated groundwater wells. And we've got a few people that are going to come up and give us their invited testimony. So we'll start with Lee Parham. Lee, if you'd just come up, you could do it here or do it up here, whatever your preference is, okay. Lee, thanks for coming down. Just state your name and the organization you
Thank you, Mr.
represent.
Chairman. Committee members, for the record, I'm Lee Parham. I'm the Deputy Director of Regulatory Program Management for the Texas Department of Licensing and Regulation. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to give y'all an overview of some of the efforts that have been undertaken to address abandoned and deteriorated water wells, kind of over the years. In the late 1980s and early 90s, and it was mainly the Texas Water Commission, predecessor of the TCEQ, and the Water Development Board, developed an estimate of 150,000 abandoned wells in Texas. In 1997, the legislature, through Senate Bill 1955, transferred the water well drillers and pump installer program from the TNRCC to the Department of Licensing and Regulation. I happen to be part of that late 80s, early 90s group, as well as the transfer. In the next about 4 years, we saw the need for a more efficient way to collect the State of Texas well reports as well as the water well plug-in reports. So in 2002, the Water Development Board and TDLR developed the Texas Online Well Report Submittal and Retrieval System. This helped us because instead of receiving hard copy paper from the drillers and people that plugged wells, they were able to enter this online over the internet. The database contains the number of wells plugged by category, and once abandoned or deteriorated wells are plugged or brought into compliance, the landowner or licensee, whoever does the work, are required to submit a State of Texas plug-in report. It'd be a first-class mail or preferably using this online system within 30 days of completion. Since 2002, you see a table there. The following wells have been plugged and entered into the system. And we have a total of 48,279 water wells that have been plugged and entered into the system. Now, prior to 2002, all water well plug-in reports, the hard copies, were scanned into the TCEQ's water well report viewer system. So, 2002 on back, those plug-in reports are housed at the TCEQ. The total, those total plugged wells are in the 103 Texas counties listed in your handout and illustrated on the color-coded maps. And if you look at it's page 3 of the handout, we had a lot of data to work with here, so we had to split it up into 2 separate maps. What you're looking at here is the 250 or more wells per county. So you can see the concentration of water wells plugged across the state. And the legend at the bottom is, you can see the color codes. But the winner in this category is Harris County with 4,250. The next map shows the concentration of water wells plugged with less than 250 per county that were plugged. And you can see the distribution there. In 2003, the Texas legislature enacted Senate Bill 279, and what this bill did was it authorized the TDLR, TCEQ, and the groundwater districts to enter into a memorandum of understanding. And what that MOU did was it helped coordinate efforts relating to investigations, investigative procedures for referrals of complaints, and basically how to better address the abandoned and deteriorated wells. So when that bill passed, we were forward-thinking enough to realize that we needed to assist in the reporting of these wells during the next year. So in 2004, the TDLR developed an online abandoned well reporting system. This was an in-house development where giving the public as well as other water-related agencies and entities the ability to report concerns about abandoned or deteriorated wells directly to us. And to date, since that time, TDLR has received 435 complaints on abandoned or deteriorated water wells, and the breakdown is there. Now, we've had ongoing efforts, and they're ongoing now, and they're going to continue to be ongoing because the TDLR's water well driller and pump installer program staff provides training, upon request, to the groundwater conservation districts, as well as we provided training to TCEQ's field staff on identification of abandoned and deteriorated wells. I mean, they're the ones that are out in the field, they're the ones that see them the most. After inspection by a TDLR or a groundwater district, if the well's determined to be abandoned or deteriorated, we notify the landowner or the person that possesses the well. Now, once this notification is given, it starts a 180-day time frame for the landowner to get back with us to say, okay, I'm either going to plug the well, I'm going to recomplete it and use it, or it's not deteriorated, I want to cap the well and keep it for future use. If we don't hear anything, that could possibly be a referral to a groundwater district or taken as a complaint through the TDLR's enforcement division. That's a possibility. The groundwater districts, they also handle complaints and work with landowners. And we try to work closely with the groundwater districts because some of the districts have plugging funds as well as plugging assistance programs for landowners that need the help. The TDLR is also a member of a multi-agency Texas Groundwater Protection Committee. The committee works to find better ways to handle these abandoned and deteriorated wells. Also, the committee developed a landowner's guide to plugging abandoned wells, excuse me, to help them understand how to plug these wells into compliance and what the groundwater dangers can be. And the Groundwater Protection Committee also makes recommendations to the Texas legislature on these type issues. So that's my presentation, and I'll be happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thanks, Lee. That was very informative. Anybody have any questions for Lee?
I do.
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Representative Ashby?
Lee,
Yes, sir.
I think, from what I can tell, and visiting with some of my locals, my groundwater conservation district folks, both in my district and some neighboring districts, you guys are doing the best job you can on this issue
Thank you.
with the resources and staff you have. You mentioned that some of the groundwater conservation districts have plugging funds or plugging assistance programs.
Yes.
Do you know approximately how many of those GCDs have access to those funds?
I could get you the exact number. I know of two.
Yeah, well,
Sure.
that's the point. I hadn't heard of it. And 2 out of 100 groundwater conservation districts is not a lot, which really drives home the point that I've been hearing from folks that work in this arena, and that is that we as a state need to be better, Mr. Chairman, about trying to help landowners that either own or inherit properties with abandoned wells. In a lot of cases, especially out in the rural parts of this state, all across state, there's just a lot of people that don't have access to resources to go in and plug or cap a well.
Yeah.
And, I don't know if we need to look at some type of statewide program like we have for a lot of areas where there's some capital available to help these landowners. But, this is, I think, increasingly an environmental and a safety issue. And, I don't have a solution, but, you mentioned the working group that you have that talks about these type issues.
Yes, sir.
I personally my staff would be curious to hear kind of what kind of recommendations you might have as far as how we can do better in terms of addressing what I think is going to be an increasingly problem across the state.
Okay, Chairman Ashby. TDLR, we don't have any specific recommendations. However, the Groundwater Protection Committee recommends water well plugging funds almost I believe, almost every session. That's the recommendation that's made. We would be happy to work with any district or anyone really to come up with proposals or work on initiatives, to try to handle this issue.
Well, I would say the same to you. I mean, I think there's a lot of people that would like to see us move the ball on the issue, and I don't have that solution sitting here today, but it just seems like increasingly I hear from people that bring up the issue. They can't afford to, pay a fine.
Yes, sir.
And frankly, in many cases are, I don't want to say it at no fault, but they've inherited property that has an abandoned well on it and don't have the personal funds to do what needs to be done to address the issue. And so I just think that we need to start the discussion, if it hasn't already started, about looking at some statewide programs that landowners can tap into.
That's great. Yes, sir.
Thank you.
Anybody else have any questions? I think Chairman Ashby brought up a good point in the urban areas where we see a lot of growth, and then the developments come up. People sold properties where there were wells, and now people are concerned about if those wells aren't capped. It could prevent or present an issue of pollution, into the aquifers. And I know the Edwards. This is a big issue. You got fast-growing areas, and you've got a lot of abandoned wells, from various sources, whether they were in the oil field or they're ag wells or whatever. And I guess what we need to find is some kind of revenue stream that would be connected to something like this in the development, or I don't know exactly. And then you would have an ongoing revenue stream to address it, because it's not going away. We've got. In your documents, you indicated we got 150,000. That number's that was in the 1990s. That number's probably ballooned to something a lot bigger than that.
And sir, we've stuck with that number. It could have increased.
Yeah.
And we stuck with that number.
Appreciate it. Thank you, Lee.
Yes, sir.
Sarah, you want to come up? Sarah Shush. Yeah, that's cool.
Chairman
Sarah,
Larson.
go ahead and state your name. And
yes, sir. Chairman Larson, members of the committee. My name is Sarah Schlesinger. I am representing the Texas Alliance of Groundwater Districts, and I appreciate the invitation to testify. And Representative Ashby, I've got the answer for you on the number of districts.
Thank you.
So that I'll get to that.
Put it in writing?
Yes, it's in writing. It's on your sheet
Even
right
better.
there. First of all, just for a matter of record, TAG is a 501c3 that represents 85 of the groundwater conservation districts and 43 additional associate members. A lot of what we do is try to collect data on what's going on in order to provide y'all with answers on what's happening as you form policies. I want to start by reminding us that part of the groundwater conservation district's purpose, as defined by Chapter 36, is to provide for the conservation, preservation, protection, recharging, and prevention of waste of groundwater. And a lot of times in these policy discussions, we find ourselves talking about quantity of water and how it is that we allocate in permitting. But as I remember testifying in front of y'all last session on Representative King's bill, we don't often get to testify or talk about quality of groundwater, but that is still a part of the charge of what groundwater districts are doing. And I wanted to give you all kind of an overview, high level, of the ways in which groundwater districts help protect groundwater quality. And it's really basic things, right? But we forget about it, which is we require registration of wells within a district. Knowing, so previously a lot of those older wells, if you didn't have them registered, you didn't know that they were there, right? So just that act is part of the protection. They have the ability to require a permit for the drilling, equipping, operating, or completing of wells. And they have to enforce on groundwater well drilling standards meant to protect the resource, both in terms of the well, but really to protect the resource, the landowner, and the resource. And they do also already have the ability in Chapter 36 to enter land in order to inspect and investigate conditions relating to the quality of water. So I wanted to just kind of remind y'all that that's where we are already. During the 85th Texas Legislature, TAG took a majority position in support of Representative King's House Bill 3025 relating to to open uncovered, abandoned, and deteriorated wells. I wanted to also provide kind of an overview, again, of statutorily what we're required to do in terms of management on abandoned wells. As we heard already, the definition and regulation of abandoned wells is the responsibility of TDLR under Texas Occupations Code. GCDs, however, are statutorily required to enforce those regulations that are set out by TDLR, again, through the drilling standards and the rest of it. And Occupations Code also mandates that TDLR and the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality develop a memorandum of understanding with GCDs to coordinate efforts to the investigation of abandoned and deteriorated wells. And I bring this up only to say that there's a really important coordination and collaboration that occurs between different state agencies. Texas Alliance of Groundwater Districts is also an appointed member of the Texas Groundwater Protection Committee, so we're involved in that. And as was already mentioned, it really is the landowner's responsibility to plug those abandoned wells or deteriorated wells, but a number of GCDs do offer assistance programs. So in a recent study that we conducted, we found that at least 22 GCDs have abandoned well plugging programs, and 17 of them indicated that they offer either financial assistance or in-kind services for that. I will say that that survey is not comprehensive of all of the GCDs in the state of Texas. It only represents the amount of districts that responded to my survey, but at least 22 of them responded, right? And I think that we're seeing a trend towards more of them trying to find ways to assist in that because it is a direct threat to the quality of the aquifer. And that's really all I have for you. I provided for you an overview of what I just testified on, as well as some additional resources. You'll be able to, in the next few months, use our GCD Index, which is a free online database, in order to search for different parameters, and it'll include in there which of the GCDs offer plugging programs, and we're going to coordinate that, hopefully, with the Groundwater Protection Committee so that folks are more easily able to find where they're able to find assistance. And that concludes my testimony. I'm happy to take any questions.
Anybody have any questions, sir? Yes, Chairman Ashby.
Thank you. Sarah, so 17, according to your survey of groundwater districts, have some type of financial assistance program?
Yes, sir. So I should again say that we have 85 members. Of the 85, I believe I only had 50 members participate in that survey, and then 17 indicated that they had financial assistance programs. So I always have to qualify those numbers.
So do you have a solution statewide as far as how we go about doing this outside of these 17, these areas of the 17 GCDs?
That is not something that TAG has discussed in terms of a position that we would take. I think that based on the support that our members had for Representative King's bill and the discussion and also just the willingness to try to come up with these funds within their district out of their local fees and taxes, I would assume that there would be a strong support towards finding a solution, but there isn't one at this time that we've determined.
Well, and I think you answered my last question. So in terms of how those 17 are funding the programs, it's through an assessment with either fine or fees?
Well, no, sir. It would be something that they've allocated within their budget. So all groundwater conservation districts are funded either through local taxes,
Right.
fees, or a combination of the two. And so the ones that I'm familiar with have indicated
So they're
within their
just putting
budget.
it in their annual budget?
That's right,
A
yes.
certain amount for abandoned wells?
That's correct.
And do you know what, I'm just curious, do you have any idea what the cost of plugging an abandoned well would be?
You know, I think it depends on the well. It depends on the depth. I believe that the following testimony, you might be able to ask them, but I think there's a pretty significant range.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, sir.
Thank you, Sarah.
You're welcome.
Chair calls up David Mock. Dave, welcome back. Just state your name and what organization you represent.
I'm David Malk. I'm with Bandera County River Authority and Groundwater District. I want to thank the chairman and the committee and Shannon for pulling us down here to be a resource for you all. Now, I've got a quick PowerPoint, but we are a River Authority, WCID, and a Groundwater Conservation District, so we're unique in the state. We have both surface water and groundwater responsibilities. Now, as a quick, way to introduce us, I'm going to give you a truncated version of our mission statement. Our district is tasked with protecting the natural resources for the state of Texas, and we take that very strongly, and we have a large appetite to get it done. Now, as a River Authority, we're in such programs as Texas Clean Rivers Program with San Antonio River Authority, Nueces River Authority. We monitor the water quality. We monitor aquatic life. We have programs where we surveil and monitor Medina Lake, which is a very important recreation and water source for the people in the county, the people of the region, and the city of San Antonio. We do illegal dumping investigations, especially whenever it has anything to do with the groundwater or the surface water. We also, right now, are implementing a USGS flood warning system. It's the first time it's been done in Texas, and it's going to give our emergency managers a really science-based set of tools to make decisions during and after a flood and before a flood event. And that's via a Texas Water Development Board grant. Now, as a groundwater district, of course, we were involved in monitoring the aquifer, DFC process, inspecting water wells, permitting production, investigating wells, and also plugging abandoned wells. So we can go to the next slide. Now, this isn't like some sensational picture I took. This is an average picture of an abandoned well in Bandera County. You can see that the wood, they were nice enough to put a piece of plastic over the hole, and the wood there keeps it from, I guess, hopefully anything going in there. You can see also all the surface completion is there, and that's also an issue. If you go to the next slide, please. Now, one of the issues we have is many of these wells are open to the environment, and a lot of people were like, can't we just cap the well, problem solved? Well, no, you can cap the well, and that does help. However, most of these wells were drilled back, a lot of them before we were even formed. We don't have any information on them. They were not properly cased to begin with, and many of them have deteriorated. So even if you cap that well, we have a lot of what's called gyp zones, gyp water in our area. So if it's not cased, that gyp water is being allowed to commingle with your actual aquifer that you're trying to draw out of. A lot of these gyp zones might only be 1-2 gallons per minute. But over 10, 15, 20 years of allowing this to go like that, you're going to actually degrade the aquifer throughout the whole region because, unfortunately, we have thousands of abandoned wells in Bandera County. And they're strategically all over the county. So we understand that that is actually the biggest danger to our aquifer. It allows a direct conduit into the aquifer because of our geology there. We don't have direct, quick recharge with the surface. And in the lower Trinity, there is no communication with the surface. But these wells can actually allow pollutants to enter. And people have a tendency to drop things in abandoned wells also. I've seen everything from trash down to dead chickens and the dead raccoons they killed that were killing the chickens. It was bizarre what you'll find on a well. We can go to the next one. And a lot of them are like this. They're out in fields and they're forgotten. We just stumble upon them. People don't know they're there. And you can see when it's flushed like that, every time it rains, it's going directly into the aquifer. I actually, when I first started, plugged that well. It only had about 10 feet of, I guess it was like chimney pipe in it. We yanked it out and plugged it. But we were lucky that somebody actually found it. They found it when they were out doing yard work. All right, you can go to the next slide. Now, this one is a unique problem you have when you have abandoned wells. It has a pump in it, and you cannot pull that pump by hand. All that surface completion has to be dealt with when you plug an abandoned well. If you go to the next slide. Now, we have an abandoned well plug program, but it's labor intensive and it can be expensive. Like I said, you have to remove that surface completion. You have to get as much of the casing out of the well. We get out there, we run a camera, we try to find information on the well and develop a game plan. Many of these wells you can't get a well log to. They predate us, and if you do find a state well log, it might say something like 5 miles west of Bandera, so you never can tie it to that well. So you go in not knowing how deep it is, how it's cased, anything, most of the time. And it can be expensive. And what we found is we don't charge for it, because if you charge for it, a lot of the people are indigent. A lot of the people can't afford it. If you charge for it, they're going to hide them. So that's always been a problem. It can be expensive, it's labor intensive, but it's probably the biggest threat to our aquifer in our county.
What does it cost you to cap one of those wells on an average basis?
If it's one that we don't have to deal with a lot of surface completion, we can do it for about $700. Now, commercially, it's going to cost quite a bit more because nobody wants to do them. They're labor intensive and there's not a big profit margin. Now, if we got to start pulling casing out, if we got to run a wireline company downhole to blow holes in the casing so that we plug it properly, that can get expensive. But generally, we can do it, but that's cost of material. That's not cost of my staff members, not cost of the equipment. Because these guys have a lot of other stuff they're doing, so I got to pull them off. It might take us a day to plug that well.
Now, how many are you capping every year?
Right now, we're doing about one a month. Like I said, we don't have dedicated staff members to do it. And that's one thing we want to see in the future. I would like to see that we have 2 guys dedicated to it and just hit them in mass. That's our eventual goal.
Dave,
Chairman Ashby.
do you have a financial assistance program that y'all offer, or is this out of pocket?
It's right out of our budget. We
So
pay.
you have some monies appropriated in your budget.
We pay for it.
That's great. Okay.
Dave, you got anything else?
Oh, no, can't remember what's on the last slide.
Okay.
Okay, yeah, I do have something else. I always knew water was political, and I always knew this area was very political with it. Lack of a better way to put it. On the way down here yesterday, I went through the beverage barn, and a delightful lady that was getting me my soda looked down at my car and actually asked me if I was here to take her water away. I had to explain to her that, no, I'm one of the good guys. We're not here after it, but it was different.
Well, we appreciate your enthusiasm, appreciate your work. There was, y'all were mentioned in the last hearing we had in Brady. The representative that represents that area in Menard indicated that we needed to follow the model of the Bandera County district, because y'all manage both surface and groundwater. And it was an issue. They said their staff was going to reach out to y'all, using it for model for San Saba, but also using it for a model out here. And you've heard the dialogue here about managing both resources. Y'all are sort of unique in that fashion, because most of them just deal with groundwater, and there's not dealing with the surface water.
Yes, sir. The 2 systems need to be managed together. They interact. Now, maybe not everywhere the same way, but they do interact. And we're strong proponents for that.
Okay. Thank you, sir. Anybody else have any questions? Thank you very much
Thank
for
you.
coming. Chair recognizes Roland Ruiz. Roland, if you come up, state your name or the organization you represent.
Chairman, members, it's a pleasure to be here with you today. My name is Roland Ruiz. I'm the General Manager for the Edwards Aquifer Authority, and my partner up there, Mark Freeberg, is also signed on in case you have any questions. I've learned to never come to these things without someone smarter than me, and so that's who Mark is. So if there are any questions that y'all stump me with, he's here to help as well. On this issue of abandoned wells, it's something that's very significant for us, mainly because, as Chairman Larson touched on, we are in a region where urbanization is rapidly occurring and spreading into areas that were once rural. And as that's happening, we're losing, or have the potential to lose, connection with some of these older wells that have existed in the past and are now being covered over, and we've seen some of that happen. So what I really wanted to do today was just share with you some examples of what we've encountered in the field and how we're dealing with them, and then also to Member Ashby's questions about financing. We are one of those districts that do offer financial assistance. We set aside so much money in our budget annually. The challenge that we have seen with that process is that we ask landowners to submit some financial documentation to qualify for that financial assistance, and we've met with some resistance in that regard. But we're happy to either talk offline about what we do or here today as well. If we can go to our first slide, or the next one. Sorry, Shannon. But while she's coming up, one of the things, and I think Sarah touched on it on her presentation, our testimony today, there are 2 words that we kind of use as a mantra that we started to use with our board, with our constituents, and that is the idea of certainty and sustainability in the water resource. In our case, it's the Edwards Aquifer. And certainty for the regulated community, and of course sustainability then for the resource, but also sustainability for us in our mission and in the financial sustainability. And I think that's where the rub eventually is going to get to is do we have enough resources to keep these abandoned wells from becoming problematic moving forward? This first slide that you see here is an example. People often think about when we discuss abandoned wells, the well off in the middle of the field there, circled in red, is what we might encounter. The one on the right is what you encounter with abandoned wells in urban areas. This particular well was on the first floor of an abandoned building in downtown San Antonio. And so you see that it can become one of the issues of out of sight, out of mind, and they get forgotten. And to what has been already stated, but is common sense, these are direct conduits to the water source, and anything on the surface can find its way there through these wells. If we can go to the next slide. This is just stating what I just told you as being direct conduits or channels for contaminants to get to the groundwater. And by our experience in history, there are two significant contamination events that have happened within the Edwards region, one in Uvalde County and one in Bexar County. In both of those situations, dry cleaning solvents from the surface made their way into the groundwater supply through open boreholes and wells or deteriorated wells. And those sites continue to have there's a plume that is formed in the aquifer that have been mitigated for by the EPA, but nonetheless they were problematic. Next slide, if you would, please. This is just simply an illustration of how an abandoned well can contribute to groundwater contamination, not just the direct conduit, but if you see over to the right, a typical abandoned well, you see a deteriorated condition in the casing, and so water can get into some of the more shallower water supplies and convey itself across horizontally to another well that is poorly constructed or deteriorated, which will give access to deeper water resources, which has happened here in this illustration. So that's just a quick little picture of why properly maintained wells are important and how they help protect the water resource, not just from one isolated aquifer, but from aquifer to aquifer, and why that's important. If we'll advance to the next slide. This is an abandoned well that we found in San Antonio and Bexar County off of Paramvital Road and Loop 410. This area was frequented by transients. It was basically kind of a transient campsite. And so you can see just what's happening around this open hole to the aquifer. We placed a cap on it temporarily to solve the immediate issue, but again, this is just one of many, and you can see there is an illustration of what can happen. If we can go to the next slide. This is an overhead aerial view of a well that was destroyed as property was being developed. And I say destroyed, it was covered up. We learned of this one by actually a citizen report. Someone contacted us and told us that they knew there was a well on this property. So the picture on the top left shows a structure in 1985. The property was later sold as a foreclosure, and the structure itself was removed. The real estate agent for the bank foreclosure process called us to inform us there was a well, said they informed the new owner of the well also. The new owner, who happened to be a developer, denied there was a well, stated that there was not a well on site. The environmental assessment did not indicate a well. Staff interviewed neighbors who provided us a signed affidavit that stated that to their knowledge there was indeed a well on site, and that gave us what we needed to go on site and investigate. And sure enough, what we found was a well that had been covered over. If you advance to the next slide, we surveyed the land with ground penetrating radar and located the well. The owner was combative during the whole process. We had to take legal action to pursue access to the well and property. When it was discovered, we realized, and what we uncovered was that the owner had haphazardly plugged the well by just simply pouring concrete down the well. That well was eventually properly plugged at the owner's expense. So that was just an example of a bad actor in that case. If you'll advance to the next slide, there are other examples where simply the passage of time has worked against us. And what you see here is an example of that. CPS Energy submitted to us a plugging application for a well, and that's the well that's pictured on the right. It's an old well. We had information that there were additional wells on the property. CPS did not know or have any information of any additional wells on their property. And by the way, the well there was drilled in 1941, and at the time, it was deemed the largest artesian well in the United States. That was pre-Catfish Farm well that y'all might be familiar with. So anyway, that was a significant well that we knew of, and when we investigated, if you'll advance to the next slide, what we discovered, we knew the one well was visible at the ground surface, but we did a site inspection, and in that inspection, we discovered 3 additional abandoned wells that were hidden from the surface. They were under manhole covers and such, and just to the naked eye, they would appear to be no wells on the location. So those wells have been addressed, and then in that case, we were dealing with another quasi-governmental entity that was more than willing to take care of them. You can advance to the next slide, and it's just an illustration where these wells were. They were under manholes, and really, you would not know that they were there unless you knew what you were looking for. If you'll advance to the next slide, and you will see an aerial view of where these wells were located and the close proximity. The original one is circled in yellow, and then there were 3 others circled in red. CPS took care of these wells by plugging them prior to transfer the property, which they were going to transfer to someone else. The cost to plug all 4 wells was roughly $1 million at a cost about $250,000 per well. Again, these were larger industrial wells, and so you see the range of cost can vary greatly depending on the type of well that you're dealing with. And if you'll advance the slide, this is an example, again, a well that was in downtown San Antonio. And if you see to the right, there's a gentleman there adding piping to what's already there. This was a well that was free-flowing. And when we were in drought conditions, it wasn't a problem because of the lower pressure within the aquifer. But once we started to get rainfall and pressure built and levels came up in the aquifer, that water started flowing at the surface. And what this creative property owner did was he just started adding piping to the top of the well. And as it got higher and higher, he just added another length of pipe. And so eventually, though, it topped that pipe, and we became aware of it. There were actually 2 wells at this site. One we knew about and was permitted, but we didn't know about the second one inside the building. And that was the abandoned well inside a vacant building. There were, again, transients occupying the building, and they had a free-flowing water source, so that you can understand that's what attracted them to that location. The owner of the building started adding the PVC pipe to keep water from flowing out. He constructed standpipe and retained responsibility of plugging the wells because he was wanting to sell the property. And prior to conveying that property to another owner, those wells were plugged. But again, perhaps if the aquifer levels had not come up and water started flowing out top of that well, we might not have known about it. And then, if you'll advance to another slide, this is an abandoned well in the basement of a downtown San Antonio hospital that was flowing into the San Antonio River. This well is now plugged as well, and the process we used here, we became aware of the well. We did apply a notice to the deed on the property to give notice to any other interested parties that if this property was to convey or change hands, it gave notice that there was an abandoned well on the property. And we started to do that as we become aware of this, so that as properties change hands, there is some notice given to the purchasers that they're acquiring something that's going to require their attention. Of course, these wells are much more expensive to plug, especially when you're talking about basements of downtown buildings in a major urban area. If you'll advance to another slide. This speaks to the time sensitivity of this issue. To the left, there was a well that was in an open field. We knew about this one, and when we started surveying the property, we realized development was occurring, and we rapidly re-engaged with the owner. In this case, the owner decided to keep the well and put it into use because the well was still in good condition. To the right, there's a Comal County development, and the developer had posted drone footage of the property being developed online. We noticed a windmill in the video footage, and upon inspection, found an abandoned well. In this case, the developer again worked with us to address the issue. So there are some good actors who respond quite appropriately when they are informed of what they have and have worked with us. Advancing to the next slide, you will see a map of our jurisdictional region. That's a footprint there. And what you see in each red dot represents an abandoned well that we know of today. If you'll advance to the next slide, as of today, we know of 279 abandoned wells, Edwards Aquifer wells in our region. We have instituted a process of prioritization. We've brought to bear technology like GIS, mapping technology, all our geologist database information that we have, and we've overlaid that into a tool that we now use to assess the risk and priority of these wells. And what we do, we take into account where the well is located, we take into account what other surrounding development is there, what kind of materials, whether it be diesel fuel tanks or whatnot in the area, to rank these by risk, knowing that we just can't get to all of these quickly. But what we can do is we can prioritize by risk and get to those that pose the greatest risk more immediately than the others. So it's a process, and it's a process we continue to refine and go through. So the message today is that it is a challenge for us, but it's a challenge that we're taking on full speed ahead. It would be great if, as was discussed today, if there might be additional resources down the line that we might be able to tap to help expedite some of these processes, because while we have probably more resources than most Chapter 36 GCDs, the pressure nonetheless is on the fees we assess our users, and at some point I think a collaborative approach, a shared approach, either through funding or through the sharing of resources otherwise would probably help alleviate some of the problem.
What do you spend on an annual basis to cap wells?
I'm sorry, what was it?
What are you spending?
Well, we've been setting aside about $250,000 a year in our annual budget for the financial assistance program. But I'll tell you that we rarely have anyone that comes forward that wants to tap that, because it requires the property owner to do something, to provide some sort of financial documentation and sharing of some of their finances to qualify. We engaged a third party to do that for us, to qualify them for us. In lieu of that, what we have started to do is, with those abandoned wells that we become aware of and they come through our compliance process, we will log their wells at no cost, just so that we can get to the well and we can assess it, put a camera down the hole and evaluate it. But that again does as Dave Mock in his comments said, it takes staff off of other things and devotes them to this. This, though, is a priority. When you talk about water quality initiatives, a lot over time has been said about the threats that may exist on the recharge under the aquifer, and that's true, but the reality is that we have actual evidence that abandoned wells have created issues for us historically and will likely continue to do so if we don't address them. So I'm happy to answer any other questions.
Anybody have any questions for him? Thank you very much. Very informative.
Thank you.
We've got our last witness, invited testimony, Greg Ellis. Welcome, Greg. You state your name and the organization you represent.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Members, I'm Greg Ellis. I'm an attorney who represents groundwater conservation districts from across the state, solar practitioner law firm. I came up here because I have my computer set down and I also like to sit, so I hope that's okay.
That's fine.
In talking about, I want to talk about the various laws related to abandoned water wells because it's not very clear cut in in various codes as to what we're talking about when we're talking about abandoned water wells. The terminology changes, the requirements change. So when you're talking about the problem of abandoned water wells, it means different things to different people depending on who you're talking to and which code they're looking at. The codes directly related to what we refer to as abandoned water wells, which we think are deteriorated or unused water wells that need to be plugged, are Chapter 1901 of the Occupations Code, Subchapter F, Sections 1901-255, where they talk about water well drillers and abandoned water wells and deteriorated water wells, and the requirement there to plug or cap an abandoned or deteriorated water well. Then you have Chapter 11, Subchapter F, Subchapter F, 11205 and 11206 of the Water Code, where it's talking about artesian water wells and the need to prevent the waste of water by allowing artesian water to flow to the surface or to flow to other strata, and how that is wasteful. You have Chapter 36 of the Water Code, Subchapter D, 36118, where it specifically gives groundwater conservation districts the authority to close or cap open or uncovered water wells. It doesn't use the term abandoned. It doesn't use the term deteriorated. And then you have Chapter 758, Subchapter A, Sections 756.001 and 002 of the Health and Safety Code, where it talks about the Health and Safety Code is discussing the need to cover wells or cisterns that are at least 10 feet deep, and there's one provision that requires covering of wells or cisterns that are larger than 10 inches, and another, a totally different provision for ones that are smaller than that. And by the way, those include criminal penalties. If you have those open cisterns or open wells, you may be subjected to a misdemeanor or criminal penalty. The bill that we got passed by the legislature was vetoed by the governor last session, House Bill 3025, would have dealt with two of these sections, the Water Well Drillers Act and the Water Code, the Chapter 36 of the Water Code, so that we would be using the same terminology. The Water Code would be amended to use the term abandoned well as that's defined in the Occupations Code, and deteriorated well as that term is defined in the Occupations Code, and create similar deadlines or make clear the deadlines by which these have to be dealt with. Now, simply having an open or uncovered water well is not necessarily a problem unless there's a potential pollutant that can be admitted into the groundwater through that open well or a improperly grouted annular space. So having an open or uncovered water well is one problem. Having a deteriorated water well is a completely different problem. That's where you have water flowing from one strata to another strata, either the fresh water going into lower strata or under pressure salt water coming up and into the freshwater zones, or even flowing to the surface. You're going to have some testimony, I think, a little while from Mr. Greg Singelman, where he's got some pictures of salt water that is flowing through the annular space out and around a well that had been recently drilled that was puddling up and going to flow into a freshwater stream that would have turned that freshwater stream, at least in that segment, into a saltwater stream, which obviously a big problem. So right now, groundwater conservation districts have the authority to require a landowner to take care of an open or uncovered well. And if the landowner does not, the district has the authority to, with 10 days' notice, to go on that property and take care of that well. They don't have authority right now to repair it, but which is another thing the bill would have taken care of, would have given the authority to repair. But they can cap it or they can plug it, and then they can put a lien on that property, the landowner's property, for the cost of doing that. As you've heard, the cost of taking care of these problems can be tremendous. Now, in the Gulf Coast aquifer, it's not nearly as expensive. In the Edwards aquifer, you're dealing with a limestone formation, karst aquifer, that's much more expensive. So the problem can be addressed by the district, but they're required to put the lien on the property. And in many of these cases, the property owner had absolutely nothing to do with the drilling of that well or the operation of that well or why there's even a well there. So I think that there are several things that we can and should look at. I did want to mention that House Bill 3025 dealt with those two problems, but was vetoed by the governor. The governor's veto message stated that the bill would have authorized groundwater districts to determine when a landowner's well has deteriorated and to compel the landowner to repair the well to the district's satisfaction. If the landowner does not do so within 10 days, the bill authorizes the water district to enter the landowner's land, repair the well, and send the landowner the bill. This would give groundwater districts greater discretion to infringe on private property rights and impose costs on landowners. Actually, that's current law. Districts already have the authority with 10 days' notice to go take care of those problems and put the lien on the property. When I contacted the governor's office, his statement there was, well, the bill didn't go far enough in limiting that authority. House Bill 3025 actually would have provided some boundaries on that. It would better define, there has to be an actual problem of deterioration. There has to be a potential waste or pollution of the aquifer before the district could go take care of the problem. So we'll certainly be working with the governor's office during this interim to try and see if there's some middle ground we can reach on what he would like to see added to the bill to make it
Just
acceptable.
talk real slow. They might be able to understand you.
I have no comment on that, Chairman. I think that the only other thing I wanted to mention to you is that the definitions in Chapter 1901 and the definition we would be using in Chapter 36 are pretty broad. The definition of deteriorated well, I think, is a good one. A well that because of its condition will cause or is likely to cause pollution of any water in this state, including groundwater. The definition of abandoned well, however, has been amended over the years so that it really doesn't mean a whole lot. An abandoned well is a well that is not in use. That's pretty clear. But a well is considered to be in use if the well is not deteriorated and contains the casing pump and pump column in good condition. The well is not a deteriorated well and has been capped. The water from the well has been put to an authorized beneficial use as defined by the water code. So if it has been used, it's no longer abandoned. The well is used in the normal course and scope and within the intensity and frequency of other similar users in the general community. That was put in there for irrigators who might irrigate for 3 months out of the year. The original definition said hasn't been used for more than 6 months. So that was kind of bad for the irrigators who frequently don't use it for more than 6 months. And then finally, the owner is participating in the Conservation Reserve Program authorized by the Food Security Act, or a similar governmental program. So if your land is in a CRP, technically your well can't be abandoned. So if you're not pumping it because your land is now in the CRP, it cannot be abandoned. That's a pretty broad definition of. It's very difficult to abandon a water well under this definition. And the last thing I wanted to mention to you is this part of Chapter 11 of the Water Code, which I think very few people really know about. There is a part of the Water Code that says open or uncovered wells. I'm sorry, wrong section. That it only deals with artesian water wells. I want to point out that any well drilled into a confined aquifer is by definition artesian because it's under pressure, so the water comes up above the first impervious level. A lot of people think artesian means free-flowing at the surface. That's called a free-flowing artesian well. That's not all. Any well that has water that comes up the column at any distance at all is an artesian well. So this provision says that, first off, the TCEQ is able to require a lot of reporting and notification of the drilling of artesian wells. But there's section 11.205 that specifically says, unless water from an artesian well is used for a purpose and in a manner in which it may be lawfully used on the owner's land, it is waste and unlawful to willfully cause or knowingly permit the water to run off the owner's land or to percolate through stratum above which the water is found. So that kind of fits the definition of a deteriorated well where the water is going from one strata to another or the water is flowing up to the surface and off the owner's land. And then there's another section, 206, that says an improperly cased well is a nuisance. An artesian well that is not tightly cased, capped, and furnished with mechanical appliances that readily and effectively prevent water from flowing out of the well and running over the surface or wasting through the strata through which it passes is a public nuisance and subject to abatement by the executive director. So the TCEQ has authority as well to take care of these deteriorated wells that are free-flowing water between strata or free-flowing to the surface, either one. I think because we have 4 different chapters now that talk about these types of wells, it would be a good idea to try and find universal, uniform definitions. And I do think we need to put some boundaries on the authority granted to groundwater conservation districts. It's very clear what they can do, and especially give them the authority to go out and repair these wells, which may be a much better and much cheaper choice than trying to go plug them. With that, I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Anybody have any questions for Greg? Thank you for your insight.
Thank you.
Really appreciate it. That includes the invited testimony. We're going to move on into the public testimony. Again, if you want to speak, there's witness affirmation forms back there. We have 4 people that have signed up to speak, and I'm going to call Rick Rylander as the first. Okay. Dale, you want to come up? Dale Dickinson.
Wow. Has anybody got an Advil?
What's that?
Has anybody got an extra Advil? We've had a lot of information that we've had to assimilate this morning, and I don't envy you guys from having to work with that. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Just turn that mic if you could. So
I would like to preface my formal statement by simply saying that I am primarily here as a private citizen, having had the luxury of going up on the Devil's River and seeing its watershed. Oh, okay. Can we get that maybe up a little bit? I'm not good at bending over.
Oh,
Thank you.
That's perfect.
Okay. Thank you. And my primary purpose, as far as the Devil's River and its surround is concerned, is a lifelong love, and I want to do everything I can to help ensure the perpetuity of that watershed and the river itself. It's a state treasure, and it should be respected as such and protected as such. Having said that, my name is Dale Dickinson. My family has been a long-time owner fronting the Devil's River, having settled within the Devil's River Basin in the late 1800s. We believe we have been good stewards through the intervening years and continue to serve that heritage today through active relationships with organizations such as the Texas Parks and Wildlife Department, Texas Nature Conservancy, Devil's River Conservancy, and Devil's River Association. As ongoing stewards, we have mounting concerns regarding outside forces coming in and disrupting our military training activities, border security preparedness, and degrading our environmental, cultural assets within the county. Specifically, we are seeing an almost exponential increase in human traffic along the Devil's River corridor and a threat of being overrun by unconstrained wind farm development and commercial water takers, all to the detriment of responsible stakeholders within the county. With regard to the ever-increasing human traffic along the Devil's River, our ranch, the Skyline, has entered into a partnership with Texas Parks and Wildlife Department to help make the river a more user-friendly experience. in turn lessening trespass issues and environmental damage to the river and its surround. I point out that the Devils is considered to be the last pristine river in the state and should be treasured and treated as such. With regard to the potential wind farm development, we are actively assisting the overall effort to halt further encroachment within the county. The ways that each of us can help make this happen are described within brochures that are available at the back of the meeting room. With regard to the subject of commercial water takers, I offer the following observations and thoughts. I am also a very strong opponent of private property rights, and I believe that I have the right to do with my property as I see fit, with the following caveats. Do nothing that is illegal, do nothing that is unethical, and perhaps most importantly of all, do nothing that harms my neighbor. The neighbor that I'm talking about is Val Verde County. Texas stands alone as the only western state that continues to follow the rule of capture, an archaic, antiquated rule of English common law that was implemented at the time of underground ignorance. Ignoring today's scientific research and subsequent findings is analogous to saying that we should still be using outhouses as they worked just fine in the same period as implementation of the original rule of capture. That analogy, of course, is too ridiculous for reasonable folks to even consider. Yet, the state legislature continues to repel efforts to repeal it. This rule of capture, in my view, clearly opens the door to unscrupulous exploitation of this invaluable resource, our precious water, the new gold standard, by the way. Given that the state legislature continues to repel efforts to repeal this rule, it appears to me that the only short-term way to halt potential unscrupulous exploitation of our precious water resource is via some type of groundwater management vehicle, perhaps with priorities apportioned according to specific underlying aquifer characteristics, i.e. Devils River versus San Felipe Springs versus Pecos River and so forth, with some type of triggering mechanism involved, such as index well and surface water triggers. Finally, I offer the following wrap-up. We have been bombarded with numerous studies over the time, too often perceived to match the individual sponsor's game plan. Common sense has long told me that an intricate relationship exists between the surface water and underlying reservoirs in this area. One of the ways that I individually look at this situation is, again, I have had the luxury of observing this river and what has happened to it over many, many years. And to put it in plain layman's language, when we have drought conditions, the river goes down. And the analogy that I give is pumping large amounts of water in terms of commercial and industrial use is analogous to a manufactured, man-made drought. That's the way I look at it. But now we have objective scientific evidence that supports this belief, to wit, surface waters such as the Devils River will suffer irreparable damage if too much water is pulled too quickly from the underlying aquifer. And it's time that we now collectively and in a timely manner work towards a common solution that addresses the needs and wants of all of the affected parties, That includes me, the city of Del Rio, and the county, and all of the property owners. We've somehow got to get everybody directly involved, or at least to where everyone feels like they're, or justifiably voices are being heard. Anything short of this, in my view, is totally irresponsible and to the ultimate detriment of the stakeholders. Thank you for your time and attention.
Anybody have any questions for Dale? Thank you very much for your passion and your testimony. We'll go to David Honeycutt. David, you just come up and state your name and who you represent.
I'm David Honeycutt. I'm a landowner on the Devils River. I'm a founder of the DRC, for past president, and I'm also a state board member for the Nature Conservancy. But I definitely have a conservation message. A lot of the things that Dale just said are I think also true. We got one chance to get this right, and first of all, let me say I appreciate you guys all being here. It means a lot. This is important to us. I've been an owner on this river for 25 years, and I like to say the first 15 years I was taken and I wasn't giving much back. I was coming out here having fun, and I was very carefree, and it was an escape. But about 10 years ago, I started noticing things that were threatening the river, so I spent the last 10 years worrying about it, and I'll probably worry about it till my last breath. But I'll tell you another thing, is I'm going to fight my last breath to protect it. I see a lot of things here that don't make sense. Some of the things that Dale said I want to reiterate and underline. Right now, some of you guys, maybe all of y'all, flew over the river, and you probably saw more water in there because there's just been some rain. But I can tell you that northern part of the river, it can't stand any withdrawals. The retreat of the river over time is real. It was only in the 60s when that Beaver Lake was there, and it's long gone. In 2015, we had, it was one of the worst drought years, although we've been in a continual drought for, I think, 7 years. It was so bad that the environmental flows, and that's an important thing to underline, the environmental flows protect the habitat for the endangered species, were threatened because of the water flows, and so the raccoons got after the hornshell mussels, and they did it in a lot of places. So that's with very modest withdrawals. There's some pivot activity where people are irrigating in the middle of the desert, and there's limited withdrawals going up in the subterranean river, which feeds the Devils River, which is the underground beginnings up above the surface expression. So already that part of the river, I think, cannot have any more withdrawals. When you move to the south end of the river, that there was a treaty that was established in 1944 with Mexico to manage the water along the border, and that was the origins or the seed to the creation of the Amistad Reservoir in Falcon Lake downstream. I think, in my opinion, except for the lake effect you get by the impoundment there, which does create a walling of water for a period of time, I think all that water is spoken for. And those cities along the border, both sides, they count on that water. It's critical. What would be really bad is if we had some type of commercial harvesting of this water, and then it started affecting the lake levels, and then you deprive these communities of the water they need, and instead you built a commercial pipeline out to Midland. And the only thing you've done is created an override in the middle of it for a rich white guy. I don't think that looks good. If you look at the people that are served by the water here, it's 98% Hispanic. And they're like the hornshell mussels. They're not. I don't know that they're that well represented in this fight or this discussion. But I will tell you, in a public hearing with Mr. Huddleston, who has done a lot of the water work for many of these conservation districts, I asked him, I said, if we put a commercial water operation along the boundaries of the Lake Amistad, after you you pull off the head, isn't it true that if you start taking commercial quantities of that water and exporting, isn't it going to affect the levels of the reservoir? And he said yes. Now, there's triggers there. You got an International Boundary Water Commission. I think you've got federal regulation on both sides of this river, which hopefully help to protect this river. But we, as a state, we've got this muscular idea, this antiquated idea about the rule of capture, and that's what we all have to live with. But what that doesn't do, and it's certain, it doesn't promote conservation. And there's no other river like this. There's only one Devil's River, and the reason this river is like it is because there aren't a lot of people around it. But if we start extracting water out of this basin, we'll damage it, and we'll damage it permanently, and we may likely unintentionally deprive people that expect that water of the water that's already committed to their communities if we take a bunch of water out here and export it someplace else. So, to me, this river is sacrosanct. And I know that it's a challenge for all of you, given the barriers that we face. But, y'all probably spend a lot of time doing things at the legislature that aren't nearly as interesting or as challenging, but you do have an opportunity here. And this is something that you could take with you and say, well, the one thing I'm proud of when I was in the legislature is I stood up against some pretty significant opposition and did the right thing and protected the Devil's River for perpetuity for the citizens of the state of Texas to enjoy for generations.
David, thank you very much for your testimony. Anybody have any questions? Thank you, sir. Got our last person that wants to testify, Greg Singleman.
Hello, good morning. My name is Greg Singleman. I'm the general manager of the Gonzales County Underground Water Conservation District. And I just want to give you a brief overview of our well plugging program. So in beginning fiscal year 2016, we have budgeted over $200,000 to our plugging fund to assist landowners in plugging deteriorated and abandoned wells. We've developed a cost share program where the district pays 90% of the well plugging cost and the landowner pays the remaining 10% of the cost. Well plugging costs have ranged from approximately $1,600 for shallow hand dug wells to over $17,000 for wells up to 2,500 feet deep. So we've got a good range of cost in there. Our registered well database lists over 157 water wells that were completed over 40 years ago, and we are systematically reviewing the wells to determine their current condition and operational status. I know this is a water well abandoned deal, but we've also got several well fields, oil and gas well fields that were completed in the Reclaw Formation that lies just above the Carrizo Aquifer, and of course that's our major aquifer. And looking in the Railroad Commission's database, there's 3 of those are orphan wells. They've been orphaned for over 20 years, and so they're just sitting out there. And I've talked to the Railroad Commission. They have a plugging fund. They just haven't got down to Gonzales County yet, but I've sort of made sure they listed those as a priority when they do get to our county. So I'll answer any questions. That's all I've got.
Well, thanks for coming down and testifying, Greg. Anybody have any questions? Thank you very much. We have another gentleman that signed up. If you guys need to get on down the road. Get on down the road. You heard that before?
Mr. Chairman and members of the House Natural Resources Committee, my name is John Shepard. I'm the Executive Director of the Texas Foundation for Conservation. Thank you for your attention to the interim charge number 3 and bringing this committee to Del Rio to see some of these special natural resources firsthand. I can't get 2 minutes into a conversation about conservation without the number 2050 popping into my head. By the year 2050, the population of Texas is projected to double. So among all the other transformations that are going to take place, we can assume our water needs will double and our outdoor recreation needs will double. And adding to this challenge, we must address current needs while making sure we still have land and water for future generations of Texans to enjoy. So it's appropriate to have this hearing in Val Verde County, home of the most pristine river in the state, the Devil's River. There are two important factors I'd like to emphasize. The people of Texas have a real and vested interest in the Devil's River. We own about 37,000 acres, including about 12 miles of river footage in the two Devil's River state natural areas. These SNAs offer important opportunities for public outdoor recreation, which is very important in a state with very little public land. And the river itself is an important source of outdoor recreation for paddlers and fishermen, and it feeds into Lake Amistad, which is widely considered one of the finest fishing lakes in the state. When I was sitting there a few minutes ago, I looked up the calendar, and Lake Amistad will host more than 100 fishing tournaments this year, and the fishermen will be on the water for about 256 days. Some of these tournaments have 300 participants, and that's not including the more casual anglers here every day. So thousands of people come here to fish the lake, and they spend money while they're here. I mention these statistics to show this single outdoor activity is a tremendous economic engine to this community. You can add in camping, hunting, and bird watching and hiking. And of course, Lake Amistad feeds the Rio Grande, which is the sole source of water for hundreds of thousands of Texans, including most of the folks that live along Chairman King's district and the city of Laredo. Groundwater pumping that affects the surface water flows means it affects the rights and opportunities of all Texans. Groundwater should no longer be considered mysterious, secret, and occult. We can balance groundwater usage and protect private property rights and surface water rights. In addition, we should be greatly concerned with the endangered species found in the Devil's River. There are 6 species that are considered threatened or endangered, and more may be listed in the future. These species depend on adequate stream flows, and if we lose those stream flows, we're inviting the federal government into our backyard. And I think everyone in this room would rather handle the endangered species ourselves without the U.S. Fish and Wildlife. Val Verde County is a case study in groundwater to surface water interaction. And Mr. Chairman, I think we should view this as an opportunity. We have an opportunity to make thoughtful, forward-looking policy that balances the needs and rights of all Texans. We have an opportunity to act before there's an emergency, and we have an opportunity to keep the federal government out of species protection in Texas. We have an opportunity to conserve one of the last great wild places in Texas for future Texans to enjoy.
We appreciate your testimony. Thank you. Anybody have any questions for John? Thank you. Any observations or any comments from any of the members of the committee? We don't have anybody else signed up, so the Committee on Natural Resources will stand adjourned.